Hello, and welcome to Horrible Fishtories, where the guppies are innocent, but the history isn't. Tonight, we're diving into the darker corners of the past, where history's most reviled figures still leave ripples behind them. If you enjoy journeys like this, strange, unsettling, and a little bit grim, consider liking the video and subscribing for more stories of villains who refuse to stay buried. And while you're here, I'm curious. Where are you watching or listening from tonight? Are you watching the guppies swim while history's villains sink? Or drifting off to sleep as ancient tyrants meet their end? Leave a comment below. The ancient Greeks believed that stories kept the dead alive in memory, and perhaps across the centuries, they also kept tyrants accountable. In the ancient world, death came in many forms: battle, disease, old age. These were the common ends that most expected. But for some, death arrived in ways far more deliberate, far more theatrical. It arrived as punishment, as spectacle, as a message carved into the collective memory of civilizations. Among the sun-bleached stones of Greek Sicily, in a city perched between two rivers, one man created a device so notorious that it would echo through 25 centuries of human history. Not because of its efficiency, there were quicker ways to kill. Not because of its scale, other rulers presided over far greater massacres. But because of what it represented, the transformation of human suffering into entertainment, engineered with artistic precision. The Brazen Bull was a masterwork of bronze craftsmanship, hollow and gleaming, beautiful to behold. Inside, it was an oven. The condemned would be sealed within, a fire lit beneath, and as they screamed, a system of pipes and tubes would transform their agony into the melodious bellowing of a bull. Death by slow roasting, performed as a symphony. Its creator was Phalaris, Tyrant of Akragas, a man whose name became synonymous with cruelty even in an age that was no stranger to violence. He ruled in the 6th century before the Common Era, when Greece was still scattered city-states competing for power and survival, when Sicily was a frontier of Greek colonization, and when strongmen called tyrants seized control of prosperous cities through military force and political cunning. But Phalaris' story is not simply one of cruelty. It is a story of irony so perfect that it seems almost mythological. Yet ancient sources insist it is true. The man who commissioned an instrument of torture specifically designed to make death both prolonged and artistically pleasing would eventually find himself sealed inside that very device, his own screams converted to animal sounds as fire consumed him from below. This is what makes the tale of Phalaris endure. Not just the horror of what he did, but the satisfaction of how he ended. His death became a parable of justice, proof that tyrants who revel in others' suffering might eventually taste their own medicine. The ancient Greeks called it nemesis, divine retribution, the restoration of cosmic balance. Phalaris' fate in his own bronze bull became the ancient world's most perfect example of poetic justice. Tonight, we journey back more than 2.5 millennia to the Greek colonies of Sicily, to a world of marble temples and bronze weapons, of democratic experiments and autocratic seizures of power. We will explore not just the lurid details of the Brazen Bull and the man who used it, but the broader context of 6th century Greek Sicily, the economic forces, political structures, and cultural values that made Phalaris' rise possible and his methods effective. We will examine what we truly know about Phalaris versus what later writers may have embellished. We will meet the craftsman who built the bull and became its first victim. We will explore the mechanics of tyrannical rule in the ancient world, the methods of control and terror, the networks of informants and the climate of fear. We will trace the conspiracy that brought Phalaris down, the popular uprising that ended his reign, and the deliberate choice to execute him in the manner he had inflicted on so many others. And we will ask why this particular tyrant, among the thousands who have terrorized populations throughout history, remains so vividly remembered. Why does the story of Phalaris and his bronze bull still captivate us 2,500 years after the fires went cold? The answers lie in the ruins of ancient Akragas, in the fragmentary accounts of Greek historians, in the moral lessons drawn by philosophers, and perhaps in something fundamental about human nature, our fascination with cruelty, our hunger for justice, and our deep satisfaction when the two collide. So settle in, watch the fish glide peacefully by, and let us travel back to the 6th century before the Common Era, to the Greek cities of Sicily, where ambition and cruelty forged one of history's most enduring tales of tyranny and retribution. To understand the world that produced Phalaris, we must first travel back to the 8th century BC, when Greek sailors first glimpsed Sicily's shores and saw opportunity written in its fertile valleys and natural harbours. Greek colonisation of Sicily began around 734 BC, driven by population pressure, land scarcity, and political upheaval on the mainland. Cities were running out of farmland, younger sons faced futures without inheritance, and political factions sought fresh starts away from enemies. Settlers from Corinth, led by an oikist named Archias, established Syracuse on the eastern coast, a site with a natural harbour, abundant fresh water, and rich surrounding land. Within decades, Syracuse became the most powerful Greek city in Sicily, rivaling Athens and Corinth in wealth and military strength. Other colonies followed rapidly. Naxos was founded by settlers from Chalkis. Megara Hyblaea rose under colonists from Megara. Gela, established in 688 BC by Rhodians and Cretans, became a major power on the southern coast. Akragas itself, founded in 582 BC by colonists from Gela and Rhodes, would become Phalaris' domain. Each colony maintained cultural ties to its mother city, but operated as an independent polis, a self-governing city-state with its own laws, armies, and ambitions. Sicily's economic value to the Greeks cannot be overstated. The island's volcanic soil, enriched by Mount Etna's ancient eruptions, produced grain yields that astonished colonists accustomed to Greece's rocky earth. Sicily became one of the ancient world's great breadbaskets. Wheat grown in Sicilian fields fed not just the island's cities, but was exported across the Mediterranean. Athens itself would later depend heavily on Sicilian grain, particularly during wartime when other supply routes were threatened. Beyond agriculture, Sicily offered access to extensive trade networks. The island sat at Mediterranean crossroads, positioned between the Greek world to the east, Phoenician colonies of North Africa to the south, and indigenous Italy to the north. Sicilian Greek cities became wealthy intermediaries, their harbours filled with merchant ships carrying olive oil, wine, metals, pottery, and luxury goods. Greeks also exploited Sicily's natural resources directly. Timber from inland forests, fish from surrounding waters, and eventually silver from mining operations. Wealth brought competition, and competition shaped the political landscape profoundly. Each city-state operated independently, governed by whatever political system had emerged from its founding circumstances. Some were controlled by aristocratic families who monopolized land and power. Others developed oligarchies, where government rested with a broader but still limited citizen class defined by property or military service. These competing polis constantly clashed over fertile land, trade routes, and regional dominance. Alliances formed and dissolved as cities sought advantage over neighbours. Increasingly from the 7th century onward, a new political figure emerged, the Tyrannos, the Tyrant. These were not hereditary kings, but strongmen who seized power through force, often presenting themselves as champions of common citizens against oppressive aristocracies. Though once in power, they ruled as autocrats accountable to no one. Greek colonists did not arrive in Sicily to empty land. The island had been inhabited for thousands of years by indigenous peoples, whom Greeks termed barbarians, non-Greek speakers. 3 main groups dominated different regions. The Sicils occupied eastern and central Sicily. The Sicans, possibly the island's oldest inhabitants, lived primarily in the west and south. The Elymians, whose origins remain debated, controlled the northwestern corner. Relations between Greek colonists and these indigenous peoples followed complex patterns. Sometimes Greeks established cities through negotiation, settling coastal land that indigenous groups were willing to cede. Other times colonization meant warfare. Greek hoplites, heavily armoured infantry fighting in organised formations, held significant military advantages. Greek colonies expanded inland, pushing native populations from fertile valleys. Yet coexistence also occurred. Archaeological evidence reveals trade between Greek cities and indigenous communities. Some indigenous peoples adopted aspects of Greek culture, particularly pottery styles and agricultural techniques. Intermarriage happened, though Greeks maintained strict citizenship rules. Indigenous peoples sometimes served as labourers on Greek estates or as auxiliary troops in Greek armies. The relationship was never equal. Greek colonists viewed themselves as culturally superior, but neither was it entirely defined by warfare. Greek religious life transplanted to Sicily with remarkable completeness. Colonists brought their gods, Zeus, Apollo, Athena, Demeter, and the entire Olympic pantheon. Temples began rising in Sicilian cities, some eventually rivaling any structure in mainland Greece. Religious festivals, including athletic competitions modelled on the Olympic Games, became central to civic life. Priests and priestesses held significant social status. This religious transplantation served multiple purposes beyond piety. Shared religious practices bound scattered colonies to a common Hellenic identity, distinguishing them from indigenous peoples. Temple construction demonstrated a city's wealth and power. Religious festivals provided opportunities for diplomatic contact between cities, for arranging aristocratic marriages, for athletic competition that channeled rivalry into less destructive forms than warfare. The gods, in Greek understanding, were intimately involved in human affairs, rewarding the just and punishing the unjust, maintaining cosmic order. A tyrant who violated this order risked divine retribution. By the mid-6th century BC, Greek Sicily had become a complex world of prosperous, competitive, often warring city-states. These were societies that had inherited Greek political traditions, but were developing distinctive characteristics shaped by Sicily's geography, its indigenous populations, and its position as a frontier. It was a world where enormous wealth could be accumulated through agriculture and trade, where political power was constantly contested, where ambitious men could rise to absolute control, and where violence, whether directed at external enemies or internal rivals, was an accepted tool of statecraft. Into this world stepped Phalaris, and into this context we must place both his methods of rule and the instrument of torture that would make his name immortal. In 582 BC, roughly a century and a half after the first Greek colonies took root in Sicily, a new settlement was established on the island's southern coast. The founding of Akragas, known today as Agrigento, followed established Greek colonial procedure. Two oikists, or official founders, led the expedition. Aristonus came from Gela, the powerful Greek city roughly 50 miles to the east. Pistolus represented colonists from the island of Rhodes in the eastern Aegean. This dual leadership reflected the mixed origins of the settlers and the diplomatic arrangements that made the colony possible. Gela provided much of the population and resources, while Rhodian participation added legitimacy and perhaps additional manpower. The choice of location demonstrated sophisticated strategic thinking. Akragas rose on a plateau roughly 2 miles inland from the Mediterranean coast, elevated above the surrounding landscape. This plateau was bordered by 2 rivers. To the west flowed the Hypsas. To the east ran the Akragas, from which the city took its name. These rivers provided fresh water year-round, crucial in the Mediterranean climate where summers were long and dry. More importantly, the rivers carved steep valleys on either side of the plateau, creating natural barriers against attack. An enemy approaching Akragas would face crossing a river and then ascending steep slopes, while defenders rained projectiles down from above. The southern edge of the plateau, facing the sea, was protected by additional cliffs and rocky outcrops. The northern approach, though more gradual, could be fortified with walls positioned to maximize defensive advantage. From this elevated position, lookouts could see approaching ships miles offshore and monitor roads leading inland. The site was nearly ideal for a Greek colony that expected to defend itself against both indigenous Sicilian peoples and rival Greek cities. Yet defence was only part of Akragas's appeal. The surrounding land was extraordinarily fertile. Volcanic activity that had formed Mount Etna had enriched the entire island's soil. The valleys flanking Akragas could support intensive agriculture. Wheat, barley, olives, grapes, vegetables and legumes. The climate allowed for long growing seasons. Unlike some coastal Greek cities, built on narrow strips of arable land, Akragas had access to extensive territory suitable for farming. This agricultural wealth would become the foundation of the city's prosperity and the source of bitter competition among elite families. The initial government of Akragas took the form Greek colonists considered natural for a new settlement, an oligarchy controlled by wealthy landowners. Citizenship was restricted to free Greek men who owned property, and within this citizen body, political power concentrated in the hands of those with the largest estates and the most slaves. These aristocratic families dominated the governing council, held important magistracies, and controlled the city's military leadership. Their wealth derived primarily from agriculture, though successful merchants and craftsmen could sometimes accumulate enough property to join the citizen class. This governing system carried inherent tensions. Aristocratic families competed for status and influence, leading to factionalism and occasional violence. Smaller landowners, though technically citizens with voting rights, found themselves excluded from real power by the interlocking networks of the great families. The economic structure of early Akragas rested on several foundations. Agriculture dominated, as it did throughout the ancient Mediterranean. The great estates surrounding the city produced grain primarily, taking advantage of Sicily's reputation as a breadbasket. Wheat grown in Akragas's territory could be consumed locally, traded to other Sicilian cities, or exported across the Mediterranean. Olive cultivation provided oil for cooking, lighting, and religious rituals. Vineyards produced wine, which Greeks considered essential to civilized life, and which served as a valuable trade commodity. But Akragas developed one additional specialty that brought the city particular fame: horse breeding. The pastures surrounding Akragas proved ideal for raising horses, and the city's aristocrats invested heavily in developing breeding programs. Horses in the ancient world represented wealth and status in concentrated form. They were expensive to purchase, expensive to maintain, and useful primarily for warfare, racing, and aristocratic display rather than agricultural labour. Akragas' horses became renowned throughout the Greek world for their quality. The city's aristocrats competed in chariot races at the Olympic Games and other pan-Hellenic festivals, winning victories that brought glory to both individual owners and to Akragas itself. The poet Pindar, who wrote victory odes for successful athletes, would later celebrate Akragas and its horses. Maritime trade formed another pillar of Akragas' economy. Though the city stood slightly inland, it maintained access to the coast and developed harbour facilities. Akragantine merchants traded along Sicily's southern shore, connecting with other Greek cities, with Phoenician settlements in western Sicily and North Africa, and with the growing network of Mediterranean commerce. These traders exported Akragas' agricultural surplus and imported goods the city could not produce locally: metals for weapons and tools, luxury items for elite consumption, specialized pottery, and manufactured goods. Craft production within Akragas itself supported both local needs and external trade. Potters created storage vessels, cooking ware, and decorated pottery. Metal workers forged weapons, armour, agricultural tools, and bronze work for temples and public buildings. Textile production employed many workers, primarily women, creating cloth for local use and potentially for export. Stone masons began constructing public buildings and temples, though Akragas' most impressive architecture would come later. The social structure of Akragas reflected divisions common to all Greek city-states. At the top stood the citizen class, free Greek men who owned property and could trace their ancestry back to the original colonists or to subsequent approved settlers. These citizens held full political rights, served in the army as hoplites when needed, and participated in religious and civic life. Within this citizen body, the aristocratic families wielded disproportionate influence through their wealth, patronage networks, and monopoly on high office. Below the citizens existed the metics, resident foreigners. These were free Greeks from other cities, or occasionally non-Greeks, who lived in Akragas and contributed to its economy but lacked political rights. Some metics were merchants. Others were skilled craftsmen, whose expertise was valued but whose foreign origin excluded them from citizenship. Metics could accumulate wealth and achieve significant social standing, but they remained perpetually outside the political community. At the bottom existed the enslaved population. Ancient sources provide no reliable statistics for how many slaves worked in early Akragas, but Greek agriculture, particularly on large estates, depended heavily on slave labour. Some slaves were war captives. Others were purchased through Mediterranean slave markets. Still others were born into slavery. These slaves worked the fields of the great estates, laboured in workshops and households, and performed physical labour that freed citizens to pursue warfare, politics, and leisure. They had no legal rights and could be bought and sold as property. This was the Akragas that existed in the decades following its founding. A prosperous agricultural city controlled by aristocratic families, enriched by fertile land and successful horse breeding connected to wider Greek civilization through trade and shared culture, but also marked by sharp social divisions and by the competition for power that characterized all Greek oligarchies. Into this context, within a few decades of the city's founding, came Phalaris. Before we can understand Phalaris and his particular brand of autocratic rule, we must first understand what Greeks meant when they used the word tyrannos, tyrant. The term carried different connotations in the archaic Greek world than it does today. For us, tyrant implies cruelly arbitrary violence and sadistic pleasure in others' suffering. For Greeks of the 7th and 6th centuries BC, tyrannos described something more specific and more political. A ruler who seized power through force rather than inheriting it legally, who governed without constitutional constraints, who answered to no council or assembly, regardless of how effectively or cruelly he ruled. The word itself may have originated outside Greece, possibly borrowed from Lydian or another Anatolian language, entering Greek vocabulary precisely because Greeks needed a term for this new political phenomenon that their traditional categories could not capture. A tyrant was not a king, basileus in Greek, because kings inherited their position through recognized dynastic succession, and often ruled within traditional constraints. A tyrant was not a magistrate, because magistrates were elected or appointed for fixed terms and exercised defined powers. A tyrant was something else, an autocrat, whose only claim to rule was that he had seized control and maintained it through force. Tyranny emerged across the Greek world during the 7th and 6th centuries BC, appearing in city after city with striking consistency. The first well-documented case was Cypselus of Corinth, who seized power around 657 BC. Corinth was among Greece's wealthiest cities, enriched by its position controlling the isthmus between mainland Greece and the Peloponnese. An aristocratic clan called the Bacchiadi had governed Corinth for generations, monopolizing political offices and intermarrying to maintain exclusive control. Cypselus came from outside this ruling circle. Ancient sources claim he had Bacchiad ancestry through his mother, but was excluded from power. Cypselus made himself champion of Corinthians, who resented Bacchiad dominance. Small landowners, merchants enriched by trade, but blocked from political influence. Craftsmen and farmers tired of aristocratic arrogance. With this popular support and armed followers, Cypselus overthrew the Bacchiadae. He expelled the leading Bacchiad families, confiscated their property, and established himself as sole ruler. Ancient historians report that Cypselus ruled without a bodyguard, suggesting either that he maintained genuine popular support, or that he had eliminated opposition so thoroughly that he faced no serious threats. He held power for roughly 3 decades and passed control to his son Periander. Around the same time, Orthogoras seized power in Sicyon, another wealthy Peloponnesian city, approximately 650 BC. The pattern was similar. An outsider to the ruling aristocracy exploiting popular resentment to overthrow the established order. Orthogoras founded what became the longest-lasting tyranny in mainland Greece, with his family maintaining control of Sicyon for roughly a century through a succession of rulers. Polycrates of Samos represented tyranny in its most spectacular form. He seized control of Samos, a wealthy island city in the eastern Aegean, around 538 BC. Polycrates turned Samos into a significant naval power, built impressive public works, including an aqueduct through a mountain and a massive temple to Hera, and made himself patron of poets and artists. The historian Herodotus devoted considerable attention to Polycrates, portraying him as a man of extraordinary ambition who eventually fell victim to Persian treachery. Polycrates demonstrated how a tyrant could use wealth, military power, and cultural patronage to achieve not just control, but genuine prestige. These cases established recognisable patterns in how tyranny emerged and how tyrants maintained power. The rise to power typically began with exploiting class conflict. By the 7th century BC, many Greek cities were experiencing economic changes that enriched new groups while aristocratic families clung to political monopoly. Trade created wealthy merchants who lacked aristocratic pedigrees. Successful farmers accumulated land and wanted political voice. Meanwhile, aristocratic families often governed poorly, extracting resources through taxation or debt while providing little benefit to those outside their circle. A potential tyrant positioned himself as champion of the excluded, promising reforms, redistribution of land, cancellation of debts, or simply an end to aristocratic arrogance. Armed force was essential. A man could not overthrow an entrenched oligarchy through speeches alone. Most tyrants employed mercenary soldiers, paid fighters who owed loyalty to whoever paid them rather than to the city's traditional institutions. These mercenaries provided military force independent of the citizen militia, which might remain loyal to aristocratic commanders. Mercenaries would fight to install their employer as tyrant and then serve as his bodyguard. The use of mercenaries was itself a break with Greek political tradition, which assumed that a city's defence rested with its citizen soldiers. Once in power, tyrants faced the challenge of consolidating control. The first priority was eliminating rival aristocratic families who might organise resistance. This could mean execution, exile, confiscation of property, or forced marriages that neutralised aristocratic power. Cypselus expelled the Bacchiadae from Corinth entirely. Other tyrants killed leading aristocrats or forced them into permanent exile. Some confiscated aristocratic estates and redistributed land to supporters, both rewarding loyalty and creating a class of landowners who owed their property to the tyrant's favour. Creating a permanent bodyguard was standard practice. Even if a tyrant had popular support initially, that support could erode. Personal guards, separate from the citizen militia and loyal primarily to the ruler personally, provided insurance against assassination or coup. These guards were often housed near the tyrant's residence, fed at public expense, and rewarded with privileges that kept them invested in the regime's survival. Public works served both practical and political purposes. Building temples demonstrated piety and brought divine favour. Constructing fortifications protected the city and the tyrant's hold on it. Aqueducts, harbours, marketplaces, and other infrastructure genuinely improved citizens' lives while also providing employment and demonstrating the tyrant's effectiveness as a ruler. These projects required enormous resources, often funded by confiscated aristocratic wealth or by the tyrant's control of state revenues. Tyrants also cultivated relationships with other tyrants and with foreign powers. Intermarriage between tyrannical families created networks of mutual support. A tyrant facing internal opposition might call on a tyrant from another city to provide troops or refuge. Foreign powers, particularly Persia in the Eastern Greek world, sometimes supported tyrants as more reliable partners than unstable oligarchies. The question of why tyranny emerged specifically in the 7th and 6th centuries BC has occupied historians since ancient times. Economic transformation was fundamental. As Mediterranean trade expanded, wealth began flowing to groups outside traditional aristocratic families. Merchants, traders, and successful craftsmen accumulated resources but found themselves excluded from political power. This created a class of people with the means to support a tyrant financially and the motivation to back someone who would break aristocratic control. Military changes mattered enormously. The development of hoplite warfare, heavily armoured infantry fighting in close formation, democratised military power. Previously, aristocrats dominated warfare through their monopoly on horses and expensive equipment. Hoplite warfare required large numbers of infantrymen, each providing his own armour and weapons, fighting in coordinated phalanxes. This meant that middling farmers who could afford hoplite equipment became militarily significant. They provided the manpower that defended the city, and many began questioning why they should lack political voice when they bore the burden of military service. Population growth strained traditional political systems. As Greek cities expanded, the number of citizens grew, but oligarchies did not expand political participation proportionally. More people found themselves excluded from power, creating larger pools of potential support for anyone promising change. By the time Phalaris rose to power in Akragas in the mid-6th century BC, tyranny was a well-established feature of the Greek political landscape. The methods were proven, the patterns understood, and the opportunities for an ambitious and ruthless man to seize absolute power in a wealthy colonial city were abundantly clear. Phalaris himself remains a frustratingly obscure figure in the years before his seizure of power. Ancient sources provide few reliable details about his origins, his family background, or his early life. Some accounts suggest he was not originally from Akragas, but came from elsewhere, possibly from the island of Astipaleia in the Aegean, though this detail appears in late sources and may be unreliable. What seems clear is that Phalaris was not a member of the established aristocratic families who controlled Akragas in its early decades. He lacked the pedigree that would have granted automatic entry into the city's ruling circle. Yet Phalaris possessed wealth, enough to position himself for political advancement. The sources do not explain how he acquired this wealth, whether through trade, through connections to wealthy patrons, or through successful military service that brought him rewards and reputation. What matters is that by the late 570s BC, Phalaris had accumulated sufficient resources and influence to be considered for an important civic position. He was, in the language of Greek politics, a man of ambition operating outside the traditional power structure, but with means to pursue his goals. The opportunity that Phalaris exploited came through a seemingly routine civic project. Around 570 BC, the city of Akragas decided to construct a temple to Zeus on the Acropolis, the elevated and fortified centre of the city. This was a significant undertaking. Greek temples required enormous resources, skilled stone masons, labourers to quarry and transport stone, carpenters for wooden elements, bronze workers for fixtures and decorations, and overseers to coordinate the work. Temple construction was also a matter of civic pride and religious duty, demonstrating the city's prosperity and piety. Phalaris was appointed to oversee this construction project. Ancient sources, particularly the historian Polianus, writing centuries later, describe this appointment as the key moment that enabled Phalaris' coup. Why the oligarchic government chose Phalaris for this role remains unclear. Perhaps he had demonstrated administrative competence. Perhaps he had cultivated relationships with key aristocrats who trusted him. Perhaps his outsider status made him seem like a neutral choice, who would not favour one aristocratic faction over another. Whatever the reason, the appointment gave Phalaris control over workers, materials, resources, and most critically, a legitimate reason to maintain a substantial armed presence on the Acropolis. Phalaris moved methodically to convert this civic appointment into military control. The temple construction required numerous workers, and Phalaris ensured that many of these workers were men loyal to him personally or who could be persuaded to support him. He may have hired specific individuals, paid them generously from the temple construction budget, and cultivated their loyalty through promises of future rewards. The Acropolis itself, as the highest and most defensible point in Akragas, gave Phalaris a natural fortress. Ostensibly protecting the construction materials and workers, Phalaris stationed armed men on the Acropolis, guards who answered to him rather than to the city's official magistrates or military commanders. The transformation from civic overseer to military strongman may have happened gradually, with Phalaris slowly increasing his armed presence until he commanded a private force substantial enough to challenge the oligarchic government. Or it may have happened suddenly, with Phalaris using a festival or public gathering when the oligarchic leadership was distracted or dispersed to seize full control of the Acropolis and declare himself master of the city. Ancient sources do not provide precise details of the coup itself, but they agree on the essential fact. Phalaris used his position overseeing temple construction to create a private army and used the Acropolis as a base from which to overthrow the established government. The oligarchic families who had ruled Akragas found themselves outmaneuvered. Phalaris's forces controlled the city's most defensible position. He had armed men loyal to him personally, rather than to the traditional civic institutions. The citizen militia, which might have resisted Phalaris, was divided in its loyalties, or perhaps simply unprepared for a coup launch from within the city's own leadership. Some aristocratic families may have attempted resistance, organising their own armed followers or appealing to other Sicilian cities for military intervention. But Phalaris moved decisively to eliminate opposition before it could coalesce into effective resistance. The elimination of rival aristocratic families followed patterns established by earlier Greek tyrants. Phalaris identified the leading families who opposed him, or who might organise future resistance. Some were executed, killed outright as examples and warnings to others. Ancient sources, though they focus heavily on Phalaris's later cruelties, suggest that his initial consolidation of power involved significant bloodshed as he removed potential threats. Other aristocratic families were driven into exile, forced to flee Akragas and abandon their property. Exile served multiple purposes for Phalaris. It removed threats without the political complications that mass executions might create. It allowed Phalaris to confiscate aristocratic estates, which he could then redistribute to supporters or keep for himself. And exiled aristocrats, though they might plot revenge from abroad, were less immediately dangerous than aristocrats still residing in the city with their patronage networks intact. Property confiscation was central to Phalaris's consolidation of power. The great estates that had belonged to aristocratic families became assets that Phalaris could distribute to reward loyalty. He appointed his supporters to administrative positions throughout the city, magistracies, military commands, positions overseeing taxation and trade. These appointments served a dual purpose. They filled the government with men loyal to Phalaris personally rather than to traditional institutions, and they allowed Phalaris's supporters to enrich themselves through their positions, binding them to the new regime through shared interest in its survival. The establishment of a permanent mercenary bodyguard followed logically from the coup. The workers and armed men who had helped Phalaris seize power became the core of a professional military force answerable only to the tyrant. These men were housed near Phalaris's residence, paid regular wages from the tyrant's control of state revenues, and given privileges that elevated them above ordinary citizens. They formed a permanent barrier between Phalaris and potential assassins or conspirators. Unlike citizen militias, which assembled only when needed and whose members maintained other occupations and loyalties, mercenary bodyguards depended entirely on the tyrant for their livelihood and status. Phalaris also sought to legitimize his rule and secure it against external threats through relationships with other powers. Sicily in the mid-6th century BC had several other tyrannies, most notably in Gela, the city from which many of Akragas' original colonists had come. Whether Phalaris cultivated formal alliances with these other Sicilian tyrants remains unclear from surviving sources, but such alliances were common among Greek tyrants. A network of tyrannical rulers, each recognising the other's legitimacy and offering mutual support against aristocratic opposition or democratic movements, provided a degree of security that isolated tyrants lacked. There is also the question of whether Phalaris sought or received support from powers outside Sicily. Carthage, the Phoenician city in North Africa, was already a major presence in western Sicily and Mediterranean trade. Greek tyrants sometimes allied with Carthage when it served their interests, despite the cultural and often military antagonism between Greeks and Carthaginians. No ancient source explicitly describes a Carthaginian alliance with Phalaris, but neither do sources rule it out. If Phalaris faced threats from exiled Akragantine aristocrats seeking help from other Greek cities, he might have found it useful to cultivate at least neutral relations with Carthage. What is certain is that by approximately 565 BAC, Phalaris had transformed himself from an outsider appointed to oversee construction into the absolute ruler of Akragas. The oligarchic families who had controlled the city were dead, exiled, or cowed into submission. Phalaris controlled the city's military forces, its administrative apparatus, and its economic resources. He had achieved what Sicily had achieved in Corinth, and what other Greek tyrants had achieved in their cities: the concentration of all political power in the hands of a single man who answered to no law, no council, and no constitutional constraint. What Phalaris would do with that power, and particularly what instrument of terror he would commission to maintain it, would make his tyranny memorable long after others were forgotten. At some point during Phalaris' rule, a craftsman approached the tyrant with a proposal for an instrument of execution unlike anything the Greek world had seen before. Ancient sources identify this man as Perilaus, sometimes rendered as Perilaus, and describe him as coming from Athens. He was a bronzesmith, a worker in one of the ancient world's most valued and demanding crafts. Bronze working required technical expertise, artistic skill, and access to significant resources. That Perilaus travelled from Athens to Akragas suggests he was seeking patronage, looking for a wealthy ruler who could commission expensive work that would demonstrate both the craftsman's skill and the patron's power. What Perilaus proposed to Phalaris was a bronze bull, but not a statue in the traditional sense. This would be a hollow sculpture, life-sized or perhaps larger, crafted to contain a human being. The bull would have a door, likely on its side or back, through which a condemned person could be placed inside. Once sealed within, the victim would be trapped in darkness inside the bronze body. A fire would be lit beneath the bull, and the bronze would conduct heat inward, slowly roasting the person alive. But Perilaus' innovation went beyond simple execution by burning. He designed an acoustic system within the bull that would transform the victim's screams into something else entirely. According to ancient sources, particularly the satirist Lucian, writing in the 2nd century CE, Perilaus installed a complex arrangement of pipes and tubes inside the bull's head. These pipes would capture the sounds made by the victim and channel them through bronze chambers that would modify and amplify the noise. The victim's screams, distorted and transformed by the bronze resonance and the pipe system, would emerge from the bull's mouth as sounds resembling a bull's bellowing. The acoustic engineering as described in ancient accounts, represented sophisticated understanding of how sound travels and transforms through different materials and spaces. Bronze resonates in particular ways. Greek craftsmen knew this from making bronze bells and other ritual objects. Pipes of different lengths and diameters affect sound pitch and quality, which Greek musicians understood from wind instruments. Perilaus apparently combined this knowledge to create a system where human vocal sounds would be modified through bronze resonance chambers, amplified and directed to emerge from an opening designed to shape the sound into something animalistic rather than recognisably human. Whether such a device could actually function as described remains debated by modern scholars. Some argue that the acoustic transformation described by ancient writers is implausible, that screams would simply sound like screams regardless of the pipe arrangement. Others point out that ancient craftsmen had sophisticated understanding of acoustics, evidenced by Greek theatre design and musical instrument construction. A system of bronze pipes could conceivably modify human vocalization enough to make it sound less human, even if it could not perfectly simulate a bull's natural sounds. The bronze itself, heated by fire, would create its own acoustic properties as it expanded and resonated. The purposes of this device, as ancient writers understood them, were multiple and deliberate. First, it transformed execution into entertainment. Public executions in the ancient world served as spectacle, as demonstrations of state power and as warnings to potential criminals or rebels. But traditional execution methods, stoning, throwing from cliffs, beheading, were straightforward and quickly finished. The brazen bull prolonged death, while simultaneously making it aesthetically interesting. The sounds emerging from the bull would be musical in a perverse sense, turning human suffering into audio performance. Second, the device created spectacular public executions that would be memorable and discussed. Phalaris wanted not just to kill opponents, but to make those deaths unforgettable, to create a symbol of his power that people would describe to others, that would travel through word of mouth and reputation beyond Akragas itself. An execution device this elaborate and unusual would achieve that goal effectively. Third, the brazen bull served to terrorise the population through its very existence. Even when not in use, its presence in the city would remind citizens of Phalaris' willingness to inflict creative cruelty on anyone who opposed him. The device made execution into theatre, demonstrating that the Tyrant could afford to commission expensive bronze work purely for the purpose of inflicting elaborate death. This was power made visible and permanent in metal. To understand how remarkable the brazen bull was as an object, we must consider the broader context of Greek bronze working in the 6th century BC. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was the primary metal for prestige objects, weapons, armour, and large-scale sculpture. Working in bronze required technical knowledge passed down through apprenticeship, access to raw materials that had to be imported and traded across long distances, and workshop facilities capable of handling large-scale projects. Creating a hollow bronze sculpture the size of a bull would require the lost wax casting method, the most sophisticated bronze working technique available to ancient craftsmen. The process began with creating a core, typically of clay or other heat-resistant material, shaped roughly like the interior of the finished sculpture. Over this core, the craftsman would model the sculpture in wax, creating all the surface details and forms. This wax model would then be covered in clay to create an outer mould. When heated, the wax would melt and drain away, hence lost wax, leaving a space between the core and the outer mould. Molten bronze would be poured into this space. Once cooled, the outer mould would be broken away, revealing the bronze sculpture with a hollow interior where the wax had been. For an object as large as a bull, this process would likely require multiple separate castings that would then be joined together. The bull's body might be cast in sections: torso, legs, head, which would be fitted and brazed together. This added to the technical challenge and to the cost. Bronze was expensive. A life-sized hollow bull might require hundreds of pounds of bronze, representing enormous material cost beyond the labour and expertise required. Greek bronze working had long tradition and high cultural significance by Phalaris' time. Bronze sculptures served as temple dedications, as memorials to athletic victories, as grave markers for wealthy families. Bronze armour and weapons signified military prowess and social status. Large bronze sculptures demonstrated civic or personal wealth and access to the most skilled craftsmen. Perilaus, in proposing to create a large hollow bronze sculpture for Phalaris, was drawing on technical traditions and cultural meanings that Greeks would immediately recognise. He was offering Phalaris a prestige object crafted with the same techniques used for honouring gods and heroes, but perverted to serve torture and execution. The presentation of the completed bull to Phalaris is described in several ancient accounts, though they differ in details. Lucian's version, written centuries after the events, presents it as a dramatic moment. Perilaus brought the finished bull before the Tyrant, explaining its design and purpose with evident pride in his craftsmanship. He described how the acoustic system would work, how the pipes would transform screams into musical bellowing, how the bronze would conduct heat evenly to ensure prolonged suffering. Ancient writers portray Perilaus as pleased with his creation, as an artist seeking approval for innovative work. Phalaris' reaction, according to these later accounts, was complex. Some sources suggest he was immediately impressed by the device's ingenuity and pleased to possess such an instrument. Other accounts, particularly Lucian's more literary treatment, suggest that Phalaris was horrified, or at least troubled by the sadistic creativity of the design. The idea that a craftsman would invest such skill and thought into maximising human suffering allegedly disturbed even a tyrant accustomed to violence. But whether Phalaris was impressed or disturbed, what happened next would become the most famous aspect of the Brazen Bull story. The device had been completed. It stood before the tyrant, its bronze surface polished and gleaming, its hollow interior ready to receive its first victim. The question was who that first victim would be. And Phalaris, according to the unanimous testimony of ancient sources, made a decision that transformed the story of the Brazen Bull from a tale of tyrannical cruelty into something more. A story of poetic justice beginning at the very moment of the device's creation. The craftsman who had designed an instrument to make music from human agony was about to discover firsthand whether his creation functioned as promised. Phalaris looked at the Brazen Bull, listened to Perilaus' proud explanation of how the device would transform human screams into musical sounds, and made a decision that ancient writers found endlessly fascinating. He ordered Perilaus himself to be the first person placed inside the bull. The craftsman, who had designed an instrument specifically to make torture aesthetically pleasing, would be the one to test whether his creation functioned as promised. Ancient sources offered different explanations for why Phalaris made this choice. The satirist Lucian, writing in the 2nd century CE, presents the most literary version. In Lucian's account, Phalaris was revolted by the sadistic ingenuity of the device. That a craftsman would invest such skill and creativity into maximising human suffering disturbed even a tyrant accustomed to violence. Phalaris allegedly told Perilaus that a man who could conceive such cruelty deserved to experience it firsthand. This version portrays Phalaris as having moral boundaries, as drawing a line at transforming torture into entertainment, even while he himself ruled through fear and violence. Other ancient writers offer more pragmatic explanations. Some suggest Phalaris simply wanted to test whether the acoustic system actually worked as Perilaus claimed. Before using the device on political enemies or criminals, the tyrant needed to know if the screams would truly be transformed into bull-like sounds, or if Perilaus had exaggerated his invention's capabilities. Using the inventor himself as the test subject served this practical purpose, while also eliminating any need to compensate Perilaus for his work. A third explanation appears in some sources, that Phalaris wanted to ensure Perilaus could never create another brazen bull for a rival tyrant or enemy of Akragas. If the device proved as effective as Perilaus claimed, other rulers might want their own versions. By killing the inventor, Phalaris would maintain a monopoly on this particular instrument of terror. The logic was brutal, but consistent with how tyrants thought about maintaining advantages over rivals. Whatever Phalaris' reasoning, the execution proceeded. Ancient accounts describe the process with varying levels of detail, but the essential elements remain consistent across sources. Perilaus was seized by Phalaris' guards. The door of the bronze bull was opened, revealing the dark, hollow interior. Perilaus was forced inside. Some accounts suggest he protested, suddenly understanding the fate he had designed for others. Other versions present him as accepting his doom with resignation or even a craftsman's curiosity about whether his creation would function properly. Once Perilaus was sealed inside, the door was secured. Ancient sources do not specify the exact mechanism for sealing the door, but it would need to be robust enough to prevent the victim from forcing it open from inside, while also being airtight enough to ensure the heat built up within the bronze body. Wood was gathered beneath the bull. Fire was lit. As the flames grew and the bronze began to heat, those watching would have waited to hear what sounds emerged from the bull's mouth. The bronze, being an excellent conductor of heat, would have transmitted the fire's warmth rapidly through the metal. Inside, Perilaus would have felt the temperature rising around him, the bronze surface becoming too hot to touch, the air itself growing scorching. And then he began to scream. According to ancient sources, the acoustic system functioned exactly as Perilaus had designed it. His screams were captured by the pipes inside the bull's head, channeled through the bronze tubes, modified by the resonance of the metal and the shape of the pipes, and emerged from the bull's mouth as sounds resembling a bull's bellowing. The human vocalization was transformed into something animalistic, something musical in a perverse way. The device worked. Perilaus had succeeded in his monstrous innovation, and he had become living proof of that success. What happened next varies depending on which ancient source one consults. Some versions claim that Phalaris allowed Perilaus to die inside the bull, that the inventor remained sealed within until the heat killed him. This version emphasizes the completeness of poetic justice. The man who designed the torture experienced it fully, dying by his own invention in precisely the manner he had intended for others. Other accounts, particularly those by Lucian and the historian Diodorus Siculus, suggest that Phalaris ordered Perilaus removed from the bull before he died. In these versions, the tyrant wanted confirmation that the device worked as promised, but also wanted to preserve Perilaus for additional punishment. Guards would have extinguished the fire, waited for the bronze to cool enough to be approached, and then opened the door to extract Perilaus. He would have emerged burned, possibly severely, traumatized by the experience, but alive. These accounts then describe Phalaris subjecting Perilaus to further torment. Some sources suggest he was tortured by other means. Others claim he was imprisoned and left to suffer from his burns before being executed by different methods. The most common version in this tradition states that Phalaris eventually had Perilaus thrown from the cliffs surrounding Akragas, a traditional method of execution in Greek Sicily. The craftsman's body would have fallen onto the rocks below, disposing of him while making a public example. The variation in ancient accounts about Perilaus' exact fate reflects the limitations of historical evidence. These events occurred in the 6th century BC, but the earliest surviving written accounts date from centuries later. Writers like Lucian and Diodorus Siculus were working from earlier sources that no longer survive, from oral traditions that had been transmitted and modified over generations, and from their own literary and moral purposes in telling the story. Each writer shaped the details to emphasize particular lessons, or to create particular dramatic effects. What ancient writers agreed upon was the moral significance of Perilaus' fate. This was poetic justice of the most literal kind, the inventor of an instrument of torture becoming its first victim. Greek thought was deeply concerned with concepts of divine justice, of hubris punished by nemesis, of the cosmos maintaining moral balance through the appropriate punishment of wrongdoers. Perilaus had committed a kind of ultimate hubris by perverting artistic skill and technical knowledge to create an instrument specifically designed to transform suffering into entertainment. That he then experienced that suffering himself seemed to ancient writers like divine intervention, like the gods ensuring justice even in a city ruled by a tyrant. But ancient writers also saw Perilaus' execution as evidence of Phalaris' exceptional cruelty. A tyrant who would kill even those who served him, who would take a craftsman's offering and turn it against the craftsman himself, demonstrated a degree of callousness that exceeded normal tyrannical violence. Most tyrants rewarded those who helped them consolidate power, built networks of loyal supporters bound by mutual benefit, and shared interest in the regime's survival. Phalaris, by killing Perilaus, showed himself willing to betray even those who had no other loyalty than to him. This made him dangerous not just to enemies, but to anyone in his orbit. The disposal of Perilaus' body carried its own significance in Greek cultural context. Proper burial was essential to Greek religious belief. The dead needed funeral rites to ensure their spirits could rest, to honour their memory, to fulfil obligations to the gods. Denying someone burial was itself a form of punishment and dishonour. If Perilaus' body was indeed thrown from the cliffs, rather than given proper burial, this would have been understood as an additional cruelty, a denial of the basic dignity owed even to enemies. His corpse would have been left for scavengers, his spirit unable to find rest, his name cursed rather than mourned. The brazen bull now stood in Akragas with its function confirmed. Perilaus, its creator, was dead or dying, having learned through direct experience that his invention worked exactly as he had promised. The device was ready for its intended purpose, terrorising Phalaris' subjects and eliminating his enemies through spectacular public execution. What would follow would determine whether the bull became merely an instrument of state violence or something more memorable, whether Phalaris would be remembered as just another brutal tyrant or as something worse. Ancient descriptions of the brazen bull provide surprisingly consistent details across multiple sources, though these sources all date from centuries after the device allegedly existed. The bull was described as life-sized or somewhat larger, large enough to contain an adult human in a crouched position. It stood on 4 legs, realistically shaped to resemble an actual bull. The surface was polished bronze that would reflect light and draw attention. Some accounts mention decorative elements, careful modelling of musculature, detailed facial features, perhaps inlaid eyes to create a lifelike appearance. The door mechanism was typically described as located on the bull's side or back, large enough to admit a person, but designed to seal completely once closed. Ancient sources do not provide technical specifications for how the door was secured, but it would require some form of locking mechanism, perhaps bronze pins or bars inserted from outside, or a door designed to fit so precisely that the bronze's expansion from heat would seal it even more tightly. The fire was placed beneath the bull, between its legs. Wood would be the primary fuel, though charcoal might be added for higher temperatures. The bronze belly would absorb heat from flames and conduct it inward. Whether this device actually existed has been debated by historians for centuries. Arguments for its historical reality rest primarily on the consistency of ancient descriptions. Multiple independent sources, Lucian, Diodorus Siculus, Pindar, and others, refer to the brazen bull in connection with Phalaris. These writers were separated by centuries and came from different regions, yet they agree on essential details. The bronze bull, the acoustic transformation of screams, Perilaus as the first victim. This consistency suggests the writers were drawing on a common tradition that preserved real historical memory rather than independently inventing similar fictions. Additionally, the technology required was well within the capabilities of 6th century BC bronze workers. Large, hollow bronze sculptures were being produced in the archaic Greek world. The lost wax casting methods could produce the necessary hollow form. Understanding of acoustics was sufficient to design pipe systems that would modify sound. Nothing about the brazen bull's construction would have been impossible for skilled craftsmen of the period. Arguments against the bull's historical existence focus on the absence of contemporary evidence. No source from Phalaris' own time or from immediately following generations mentions the device. The earliest surviving references come from centuries later. This gap raises the possibility that the brazen bull was invented by later writers as a symbol of tyrannical cruelty rather than being a real historical object. The story has literary qualities that make it almost too perfect. The inventor becoming the first victim, the poetic justice of the outcome, the vivid horror of the execution method. These qualities might suggest literary invention rather than historical fact. Some scholars argue that if such a remarkable device had existed, contemporary writers should have mentioned it. The silence of earlier sources is suspicious. The brazen bull might have been propaganda created by Phalaris' enemies after his fall, a way to blacken his reputation by attributing to him an instrument so sadistic that it would make him seem uniquely evil even by the standards of other tyrants. The physics of how such a device would actually function present interesting questions. Bronze is indeed an excellent conductor of heat. A fire beneath the bull would rapidly heat the metal, and that heat would be conducted throughout the bronze body. The victim inside would experience rising temperature in stages. First, the air would become uncomfortably hot. Then the bronze surfaces would become too hot to touch. Eventually, the radiant heat within the enclosed space would damage skin and respiratory tissue. Death would likely result from a combination of hypothermia, dehydration, respiratory damage from breathing superheated air, and burns. The process would not be quick. Estimates suggest it might take anywhere from 30 minutes to several hours depending on fire intensity. The acoustic transformation described in ancient sources is more difficult to evaluate. Human vocal cords produce sound waves that can be modified by the shape and material of the spaces they pass through. Bronze resonates at particular frequencies. pipes of different lengths and diameters act as resonators, emphasizing some frequencies and filtering out others. In principle, a system of bronze tubes could modify human vocalization enough to make it sound less human and more animalistic. However, whether such a system could produce sounds convincingly resembling a bull's bellow is questionable. More plausibly, the pipe system might have produced sounds that were ambiguously animal-like, distorted enough that observers could interpret them as bull sounds while not being perfect imitations. Alternative theories about the bull's origin offer different explanations. One theory suggests the device may have begun as a religious statue, perhaps a bronze bull created as a temple dedication. Later, hostile writers invented the story that Phalaris had perverted this religious object into an instrument of torture, making the story symbolically powerful. The tyrant not just cruel but impious. Another theory proposes that smaller bronze vessels, shaped like bulls, existed for animal sacrifice or burning incense. These hollow bronze forms, with openings for fire, used in religious rituals, might have been exaggerated or misunderstood. The brazen bull story could have developed from reinterpreting such ritual objects. A third possibility is that the entire story was invented as a symbolic representation of tyrannical cruelty rather than describing a real device. The brazen bull serves as a perfect metaphor. The perversion of artistic skill to create instruments of torture, the transformation of human suffering into entertainment, the sadistic creativity that characterizes the worst forms of tyranny. Ancient writers might have created this story to encapsulate everything evil about tyrannical rule in a single vivid image. Archaeological evidence from Akragas has not resolved these questions. Extensive excavations at modern Agrigento have uncovered temples, fortifications, residential areas, and burial sites, but no physical traces of a brazen bull have been discovered. No bronze fragments that might belong to such a device, no contemporary inscriptions mentioning it, no artistic depictions from the period showing the bull. This absence does not prove the bull never existed. Bronze was valuable and would likely have been melted down and reused after Phalaris' fall. But neither does archaeology provide evidence supporting the bull's existence. Ancient writers were fascinated by the brazen bull story because it exemplified concepts central to Greek moral thought. The idea of hubris, excessive pride that invites divine punishment, fits Perilaus perfectly. He used his skills not to honour gods or benefit humanity, but to create an instrument of torture, and he immediately experienced the consequences. The concept of nemesis, divine retribution that restores balance, explains both Perilaus' fate and eventually Phalaris' own death in the bull. The Greeks believed the universe maintained moral order, that violations would be corrected through appropriate punishment. The brazen bull also served as a cautionary symbol about the corruption of civilization. Bronze working represented technological advancement and artistic achievement. Using this technology to create torture devices symbolized how human progress could be perverted, how the same skills that built temples could be turned to evil purposes. For Greek writers reflecting on tyranny, the brazen bull became a powerful symbol of what happened when power was unrestrained by law or morality. Whether the device actually existed mattered less than what it represented about human cruelty and the inevitable justice that Greek thought insisted would eventually correct such violations. Phalaris governed Akragas through a combination of personal control and delegated authority. He appointed subordinate officials to handle administrative functions, collecting taxes, overseeing markets, managing public works, and enforcing his decrees. These officials were selected for loyalty rather than aristocratic pedigree or traditional qualifications. Many were men who owed their positions entirely to Phalaris, who had risen from obscurity through the tyrant's favour, and whose continued power depended on his regime's survival. This created an administrative class bound to the tyrant by self-interest rather than a civic duty or constitutional obligation. Tax collection became more systematic and more oppressive under Phalaris' rule. Tyrants needed revenue to pay mercenary bodyguards, fund public works, and maintain the apparatus of control. Phalaris likely increased taxation on agricultural production, taking larger shares of grain harvests from estates both large and small. He controlled trade through the harbour, imposing fees on merchants and monitoring the flow of goods. This generated income while also providing intelligence about who was prospering, who was accumulating wealth that might fund opposition, and who was maintaining suspicious contacts with other cities. The enforcement apparatus required to maintain autocratic control extended beyond the mercenary bodyguard. Phalaris needed men to arrest suspects, guard prisoners, carry out executions, and patrol the city watching for signs of conspiracy or dissent. These enforcers operated outside traditional legal frameworks. They answered to Phalaris directly rather than to magistrates or councils. Their presence throughout Akragas created a constant reminder that the tyrant's power reached into every neighbourhood, every marketplace, every gathering place. The brazen bull, despite its fame, was likely not the primary method of execution during Phalaris' rule. Ancient sources identify several categories of victims for the bull: political opponents who conspired against the tyrant, criminals whose executions would serve as spectacular public warnings, and defeated enemies captured in military conflicts. The bull's use seems to have been reserved for cases where Phalaris wanted to make a particular impression, where execution needed to be memorable and discussed. Public spectacles served tyrannical rule by demonstrating power, by entertaining the population and binding them to the regime through shared experience of the execution ritual, and by creating fear so intense that opposition became psychologically difficult. How frequently the bull was used remains unclear from ancient sources. Some accounts suggest it was employed regularly, that the bronze sculpture became a familiar and dreaded sight in Akragas. Other sources imply it was used more sparingly, that its very existence provided deterrent effect without needing constant use. The truth likely lies between these extremes. The bull was used often enough that people knew it was a real threat, but not so constantly that executions became routine and lost their psychological impact. Phalaris employed other execution methods that required less elaborate preparation. Throwing victims from the cliffs surrounding Akragas was a traditional Sicilian method that continued under his rule. The condemned would be forced to the cliff edge and pushed off, falling onto rocks below. This required no special equipment, could be done quickly, and disposed of bodies efficiently. Traditional executions by beheading or strangulation also continued for criminals and lesser offenders. Imprisonment served to hold conspirators for interrogation, to isolate potential threats while Phalaris decided their fates, and to demonstrate that the tyrant could deprive citizens of freedom indefinitely without trial or legal process. Phalaris' economic policies centered on concentrating wealth and resources under his control. The confiscation of aristocratic estates that had occurred during his initial seizure of power continued as he identified new threats or simply desired particular properties. These confiscated lands could be redistributed to supporters, generating loyalty and creating a class of landowners who owed their prosperity to the tyrant. Alternatively, Phalaris could retain estates for himself, working them with slave labour and using the agricultural output to feed his mercenaries and fund his administration. Public works projects served both practical and political purposes. Phalaris may have continued work on the temple to Zeus that had provided cover for his coup, completing it to demonstrate piety and civic leadership. Fortification improvements strengthened Akragas' defences, while also making the city more difficult for internal rebels to seize. Harbour facilities and marketplace improvements genuinely benefited commerce, while giving Phalaris greater control over trade. These projects also provided employment, potentially maintaining some popular support among common citizens who benefited from construction wages. Military actions extended Akragas' power beyond the city itself. Phalaris conducted campaigns against neighbouring indigenous Sicilian peoples, the Sicans who controlled territory inland from Greek settlements. These military expeditions served multiple purposes. They expanded Akragas' agricultural territory, bringing more land under cultivation and more resources under the Tyrant's control. They provided opportunities for military glory that enhanced Phalaris' reputation. They kept his mercenary forces employed and experienced, and they directed potential violence outward against external enemies rather than allowing it to fester internally. Relations with other Greek cities in Sicily were complex. Phalaris may have sought alliances with other tyrants who faced similar challenges maintaining power. Ancient sources do not provide detailed accounts of Phalaris' diplomatic relationships, but tyrannical networks were common in archaic Greece. Conversely, oligarchic cities might view Phalaris as a threat, fearing that his example could inspire similar coups in their own territories. Whether Phalaris engaged in direct military conflicts with other Greek cities remains unclear, though competition for territory and resources made such conflicts likely. The use of informants and surveillance created a climate where trust eroded and private conversations carried risk. Phalaris encouraged citizens to report suspicious behaviour, rewarding informants with money or favours. This system served intelligence-gathering purposes, allowing the tyrant to learn of conspiracies before they matured. It also created paranoia, making potential conspirators afraid to speak openly, even to family members or close friends. When people cannot trust each other, organising collective resistance becomes nearly impossible. Restrictions on assembly limited opportunities for political organising. Large gatherings outside religious festivals or official civic events became suspect. Private meetings of citizens, particularly those involving men from prominent families, drew scrutiny. Public speech was monitored for criticism of the tyrant or praise for constitutional government and shared power. This surveillance did not require sophisticated technology, simply informants scattered throughout the population, people willing to report what they heard in exchange for the tyrant's favour, or out of fear of being accused themselves if they remained silent. The social effects of living under such conditions shaped daily life in Akragas. Citizens learned to be careful about what they said and where they said it. Expressions of dissatisfaction were confined to trusted family circles or not voiced at all. People avoided associating with those suspected of disloyalty to the regime, not necessarily from genuine support for Phalaris, but from self-preservation. This climate of fear did not require that everyone be arrested or executed. The knowledge that the tyrant could target anyone, that informants existed throughout the city, that punishment would be severe and might extend to families, was sufficient to suppress most open opposition. Which social classes suffered most under Phalaris' rule depended on whether one posed a threat to his power. Aristocratic families, particularly those connected to the previous oligarchic government, faced the greatest danger. Their wealth and traditional authority made them natural centres of opposition. Many had been killed or exiled in the initial coup, but those who remained lived under constant suspicion. Common citizens, farmers, craftsmen, traders experienced increased taxation and loss of political voice, but if they avoided conspiring against the tyrants, they might live relatively unmolested. Some may have even appreciated Phalaris's breaking of aristocratic monopolies, seeing in his rule a kind of rough justice against families who had previously excluded them from power. But any popular support Phalaris enjoyed was always precarious, based on fear and material calculation rather than genuine loyalty or belief in his right to rule. Ancient sources provide frustratingly few names of specific individuals who suffered under Phalaris's rule. The literary tradition focused more on the tyrant himself and on the brazen bull than on documenting his victims individually. This absence reflects both the passage of time between events and their recording, and the tendency of ancient historians to treat victims of tyranny as anonymous masses rather than distinct persons whose stories deserved preservation. Yet some names do appear in the sources, offering glimpses of who actually experienced Phalaris's cruelty. The most famous alleged victim, though the chronology remains deeply disputed by scholars, was Zeno of Elea. Zeno was a philosopher, student of Parmenides, known for paradoxes that challenged conventional understanding of motion and infinity. Some ancient accounts claim that Zeno was involved in a conspiracy against Phalaris and was captured and tortured. According to these versions, Zeno refused under torture to reveal his fellow conspirators. One particularly dramatic account suggests that Zeno bit off his own tongue and spat it at Phalaris rather than risk revealing information under continued torture. The problem with this story is chronological. Modern scholars examining the dates of Zeno's life and Phalaris's rule have concluded they likely did not overlap. Zeno appears to have lived in the mid-5th century BC, decades after Phalaris's death. The story connecting them may have been invented by later writers who wanted to associate the famous philosopher with resistance to tyranny, or who conflated different historical figures named Zeno. Yet the story's persistence in multiple ancient sources suggests it held meaning for Greek audiences regardless of historical accuracy. The philosopher refusing to betray his principles even under extreme torture represented an ideal of resistance to tyrannical power. Religious figures may have opposed Phalaris on grounds that his rule violated divine order and proper piety. Greek religion was deeply embedded in civic life, and priests held significant social authority. A tyrant who seized power unconstitutionally and ruled through fear might face criticism from religious leaders who saw themselves as guardians of tradition and proper relationship with the gods. Ancient sources do not preserve names of specific priests executed by Phalaris, but references to his impiety and to religious opposition suggest that some religious figures paid with their lives for speaking against the tyranny. The families of those executed faced uncertain fates, depending on Phalaris's calculation of threat and advantage. In some cases, extending punishment to family members served strategic purposes. Executing not just a conspirator, but his adult sons eliminated potential future revenge. Confiscating an entire family's property, rather than just the condemned individual's share, maximised economic benefit to the tyrant. Forcing widows and children into exile dispersed potential centres of sympathy and opposition. Greek culture placed enormous importance on family honour and the obligation to avenge wronged relatives, so eliminating entire families could seem strategically prudent to a tyrant concerned with long-term security. Yet indiscriminate slaughter of families carried risks. It could generate sympathy for victims, turn neutral citizens against the regime, and create moral outrage that transcended factional politics. Phalaris may have calibrated his approach, targeting families of major threats while leaving alone the relatives of lesser conspirators. Ancient sources do not provide systematic accounts of family punishment policies, but references to property confiscation and exile suggest that families of executed men often lost everything even if they retained their lives. Exile became the fate of numerous Akragantine citizens who fled the city rather than risk Phalaris' suspicion. These exiles formed communities in other Sicilian Greek cities, and perhaps in mainland Greece. Exile communities of dispossessed aristocrats were common in the Greek world, where political upheavals regularly drove losing factions from their home cities. These exiles maintained their identity as Akragantines, preserved their grievances against Phalaris, and presumably plotted eventual return. They also served as living testimony to Phalaris' tyranny, spreading stories of his cruelty to audiences in other cities and shaping the reputation that would eventually be recorded in written sources. Exile communities posed both political and propaganda threats to tyrants. Politically, exiles might seek military assistance from other cities to overthrow the regime that had expelled them. They could provide intelligence about Akragas' defences, suggest vulnerable moments for attack, and promise rewards to any power that helped restore them. As propaganda, exiles offered first-hand accounts of tyrannical abuses to audiences predisposed to view tyranny negatively. Their testimony, whether accurate or exaggerated, shaped how other Greeks understood what was happening in Akragas. Whether anyone survived the Brazen Bull itself remains unclear. The device was designed to kill, and the accounts we have focus on completed executions. Yet some ancient versions of Perilaus' story claim he was removed before death, suggesting that extraction from the bull was possible if Phalaris wished it. Perhaps some victims were subjected to the bull as torture rather than execution, removed after sufficient suffering to serve as living warnings. Such survivors would carry visible evidence of their ordeal: burns, trauma, perhaps permanent injuries. Their very existence would reinforce the bull's terror, showing that experiencing it was possible and that Phalaris could calibrate punishment according to his purposes. If survivors of the bull or other torture methods existed, their testimonies may have significantly shaped later historical accounts. Direct witnesses to the device's effects, to the sounds it produced, to the physical and psychological experience of being targeted by Phalaris' cruelty would provide the concrete details that later writers incorporated into their narratives. The consistency of accounts about the Brazen Bull across different sources might reflect a common origin in survivor testimony that had been transmitted through oral tradition before being written down. The psychological impact on Akragas' population extended beyond those directly targeted. Living under tyranny created an atmosphere where trust eroded, where public speech became dangerous, where the ordinary interactions of civic life were shadowed by fear. Citizens learned to monitor their own words, to avoid topics that might be interpreted as criticism, to perform loyalty even when feeling resentment. This psychological adaptation to autocratic rule affected how people related to each other, diminishing solidarity, encouraging mutual suspicion, fragmenting the social bonds that might otherwise support collective resistance. Ancient descriptions emphasize this climate of fear as defining daily experience in Phalaris' Akragas. People walked carefully through public spaces, aware that informants might be listening. Conversations in marketplaces and gathering places avoided politics entirely, or included performative praise for the tyrant's rule. The constant awareness of surveillance, whether real or imagined, shaped behaviour in ways that made opposition difficult to organise and dangerous to express. This psychological dimension of tyranny, the internalisation of fear and self-censorship, may have been as important to Phalaris' control as the actual violence he inflicted. The brazen bull needed to be used only occasionally for its deterrent effect to be constant, for the knowledge that such punishment existed to govern people's choices and silence their dissent. Opposition to Phalaris existed from the moment he seized power, though organising effective resistance under conditions of surveillance and fear proved extraordinarily difficult. Resistance movements within Akragas drew primarily from the aristocratic families who had lost power and property during Phalaris' coup. These families retained social networks, ties of kinship and marriage that connected them to others who resented the tyranny. Some possessed hidden wealth that had escaped confiscation, resources that could fund conspiracy. They had the most to gain from Phalaris' overthrow, restoration of their political dominance, recovery of confiscated estates, revenge for executed relatives. Yet, aristocratic conspirators faced severe challenges organising under Phalaris' surveillance network. They could not meet openly or in large groups without drawing suspicion. Communication had to occur through trusted intermediaries, often family members or long-established clients whose loyalty was beyond question. Even then, the risk remained that someone within the conspiracy might be an informant, either from genuine loyalty to Phalaris, or from fear of being accused if the plot was discovered. Conspiracies had to remain small to maintain secrecy, but small conspiracies lacked the manpower to overthrow a tyrant, protected by mercenary guards, and supported by an administrative apparatus of loyal officials. Ancient sources provide few details about specific conspiracies during Phalaris' rule, which likely reflects both the passage of time before events were recorded and the success of Phalaris' security measures in preventing conspiracies from maturing into serious threats. The sources mention plots in general terms, referring to conspirators being discovered and executed, but rarely name specific individuals or describe detailed plans. This absence itself tells us something. Either conspiracies were detected early before they developed into memorable events worth recording, or Phalaris was effective enough at suppressing information that details never reached the writers who would later chronicle his reign. When conspiracies were discovered, Phalaris responded with severity calculated to deter future plots. Mass executions eliminated not just the primary conspirators, but also their associates, anyone who might have known about the plot or who might seek revenge. The Brazen Bull served particular purpose in executing conspirators, as their deaths became public spectacles that demonstrated the consequences of resistance. Increased security measures followed discovered plots, expanded surveillance networks, more informants, additional restrictions on movement and assembly, and closer monitoring of aristocratic families already under suspicion. Exiled aristocrats, safely beyond Phalaris' direct reach, posed a different kind of threat. These men preserved their identity as rightful citizens of Akragas temporarily displaced by a usurper. They maintained contact with family members and allies still within the city, receiving information about conditions there, and perhaps coordinating with internal opposition. Most importantly, exiles could seek foreign military support for an invasion that would overthrow Phalaris and restore them to power. Securing such foreign support required convincing another Greek city that intervening in Akragas served its interests. Exiles might offer economic concessions, promises of favourable trade agreements, or alliance terms if they regained power. They might appeal to shared aristocratic interests, arguing that allowing tyranny to succeed in Akragas threatened oligarchic governments throughout Sicily. They might seek help from other Sicilian tyrants who competed with Phalaris for regional dominance. Ancient sources do not provide detailed accounts of exile diplomacy during Phalaris' rule, but the pattern was common enough in Greek politics that such efforts almost certainly occurred. The challenges facing any conspiracy, whether internal or supported by exiles, were formidable. Phalaris' mercenary bodyguard owed loyalty directly to him through regular pay and privileges. Unlike citizen militias that might be divided by factional sympathies, mercenaries had clear incentive to defend the regime that employed them. They were professionals, trained and equipped for combat, stationed strategically to protect the tyrant and suppress resistance. Any conspiracy would need either to neutralize these guards through bribery or surprise, or to assemble sufficient military force to overcome them directly. Coordinating action presented enormous difficulty. Conspirators within the city needed to communicate with each other and with potential allies outside Akragas while avoiding detection by informants. They needed to stockpile weapons without being discovered. They needed to choose a moment when Phalaris was vulnerable, perhaps during a religious festival when security might be relaxed, or when the tyrant was separated from his main bodyguard. And they needed to move quickly once action began, before Phalaris could rally his forces and crush the uprising. Failed conspiracies carried catastrophic consequences that deterred future attempts. Conspirators faced not just execution, but torture and public humiliation before death. Their families lost property and might be exiled or killed. Anyone associated with them became suspect. The failure demonstrated Phalaris' power and competence, showing that he could detect threats and eliminate them before they matured. Each failed conspiracy strengthened the psychological barrier against resistance, reinforcing the sense that opposing the tyrant was futile and that survival depended on accommodation rather than resistance. Whether external Greek powers attempted intervention against Phalaris remains unclear from surviving sources. Syracuse, the most powerful Greek city in Sicily, might have viewed Phalaris' tyranny as either a threat to stability or simply as Akragas' internal affair. Gala, from which many of Akragas' original colonists had come, might have felt some obligation to act against a tyrant oppressing a daughter city. Mainland Greek cities, particularly those that maintained oligarchic governments, might have considered Phalaris' success dangerous to their own political systems. Yet no ancient source describes a coordinated external intervention during Phalaris' active rule, suggesting that other powers either found him tolerable, saw no advantage in intervention, or were deterred by the costs and risks of military action. Religious sanctuaries played complex roles in the politics of tyranny. Temples and sacred precincts were traditionally places of asylum where suppliants could seek protection from enemies. Greek religious custom made violation of sanctuary a serious impiety that risked divine punishment. This created tension for tyrants. Respecting sanctuary meant allowing potential enemies refuge beyond their control. But violating sanctuary risked offending the gods and alienating the population whose religious sensibilities might be stronger than their political loyalties. Whether specific sanctuaries in or near Akragas served as centres of opposition or refuges for those fleeing persecution cannot be determined from surviving sources. Priests might offer quiet support to conspirators through their moral authority and their control of sacred spaces. Temples controlled property and resources that could potentially support resistance. Religious festivals brought citizens together in ways that otherwise restricted assembly did not permit, creating opportunities for conspirators to communicate. Yet temples also depended on civic support and funding, making open opposition to the tyrant risky for religious institutions themselves. The role of religion in resistance to Phalaris likely varied between cautious moral criticism that stopped short of active conspiracy and genuine sanctuary for individuals fleeing immediate persecution. Cultural and religious life in Akragas did not cease under Phalaris' tyranny. Greek cities maintained their religious calendars, celebrated festivals, honoured the gods through sacrifice and temple construction regardless of political circumstances. Phalaris likely recognised that disrupting religious life would alienate the population and risk divine displeasure, so traditional practices continued even as political freedom was suppressed. Temples required maintenance and construction. Religious festivals brought citizens together in sanctioned gatherings that reinforced communal identity. Athletic competitions, often associated with religious celebrations, provided entertainment and opportunities for prominent families to display wealth through sponsoring competitors or hosting events. The temple to Zeus, whose construction had provided Phalaris the opportunity for his coup, may have been completed during his rule. Finishing a temple dedicated to the king of the gods would demonstrate both piety and civic responsibility, positioning Phalaris as a legitimate ruler who fulfilled traditional obligations rather than simply a usurper maintaining power through force. Other temples and sacred buildings would require ongoing maintenance and occasional expansion. Religious infrastructure served practical purposes beyond worship. Temples stored valuable offerings, employed priests and attendants, and functioned as community centres for activities beyond ritual observance. Ancient sources present a paradox regarding Phalaris' relationship with culture and learning. Later writers, particularly those creating moral exemplar about tyranny, sometimes portrayed tyrants as entirely consumed by cruelty and paranoia, incapable of appreciating art or intellectual achievement. Yet, other accounts suggest Phalaris invited poets and intellectuals to his court, that he sought to surround himself with cultural prestige despite his brutal methods of rule. This pattern was common among Greek tyrants. Polycrates of Samos famously patronised poets including Anacreon, while Periander of Corinth was counted among the 7 sages of Greece despite being a tyrant. If Phalaris did attract intellectuals and artists, his motivations would have been both personal and political. Personal interest in poetry, philosophy, or artistic achievement was not incompatible with political ruthlessness. Many historical figures have combined cultural sophistication with capacity for extreme violence. Politically, cultural patronage served legitimizing functions. A tyrant who supported poets and commissioned artworks positioned himself as continuing the traditions of cultured aristocratic leadership. Cultural achievements brought prestige to the city, making Akragas known for more than just its tyrant's cruelty. And intellectuals dependent on the tyrant's patronage were unlikely to criticize his rule publicly. Construction projects during Phalaris' reign served multiple purposes. Fortifications strengthened Akragas' defences against external enemies and made the city more difficult for internal rebels to seize. Walls, gates and towers required significant labour and resources, but they provided tangible security benefits while also demonstrating the tyrant's concern for civic protection. Public buildings, administrative structures, marketplaces, possibly theatres or assembly spaces, improved the city's infrastructure while keeping large numbers of workers employed and generating economic activity that benefited merchants and craftsmen. Infrastructure works like roads, water systems, and harbour improvements genuinely enhanced daily life for Akragas' population. A tyrant who could point to such improvements had some claim to effective governance, an argument that rule by a single competent autocrat delivered better results than quarrelling oligarchic factions had managed. These projects also kept the population occupied with productive labour rather than idle discontent, and they created visible monuments to the tyrant's rule that would outlast his lifetime. Whether Phalaris used cultural patronage and public works primarily to maintain legitimacy or popular support is difficult to determine. Tyrannical rule rested fundamentally on force: the mercenary bodyguard, the surveillance network, the willingness to execute opponents. But force alone created grudging compliance rather than stable governance. Cultural patronage and public works added a second layer of legitimacy, allowing citizens who might otherwise oppose tyranny to point to tangible benefits and to take pride in their city's achievements, even while resenting their political subjugation. Religious practices continued with Phalaris, necessarily positioning himself as pious and favoured by the gods. Greek religion was embedded in civic life too deeply for a ruler to ignore or reject it. Phalaris would have participated in major festivals, made appropriate sacrifices, ensured that traditional rituals were observed. Whether he claimed explicit divine sanction for his rule, presenting himself as chosen by the gods or as implementing divine will, remains unclear from surviving sources. Such claims were risky, as they could be tested if military defeats or natural disasters suggested divine disfavour. More likely, Phalaris presented himself as maintaining proper relationship with the gods through traditional piety while avoiding grandiose claims that might invite scepticism or divine retribution. Daily life for ordinary citizens of Akragas continued with a mixture of normalcy and constant awareness of political constraints. Farmers still worked their fields, following the agricultural calendar that governed Mediterranean life. Craftsmen produced pottery, metalwork, textiles and other goods. Merchants conducted trade through the harbour and in marketplaces. Social gatherings occurred in homes, at symposia for wealthy citizens, in public spaces during festivals. Family life continued. Marriages arranged, children raised, property transferred between generations. Yet tyranny's presence shaped these ordinary activities in subtle ways. Economic life was affected by taxation levels, by the tyrant's control of trade, by the uncertainty about property rights when confiscation remained a political tool. Social gatherings were constrained by awareness that informants might be present, that conversations about politics were dangerous, that expressing opinions about the regime carried risk. The rhythm of daily life continued, but the freedom to speak openly, to participate in political decisions, to challenge authority through legal or constitutional means was absent. The extent to which tyranny disrupted normal existence varied across social classes and individual circumstances. For aristocratic families who had lost political power, confiscated property, and executed relatives, tyranny was catastrophic disruption. For common citizens who had never held political power under the previous oligarchy and who were not suspected of conspiracy, daily life might proceed with relatively little change beyond increased taxation and loss of political voice they had barely possessed. For those who benefited from the tyranny, officials appointed by Phalaris, merchants who received favourable treatment, workers employed on public projects, the regime might actually improve their circumstances despite its repressive nature. This complexity in how tyranny affected different citizens helps explain how Phalaris maintained power. A regime that oppressed everyone equally would face universal opposition. A regime that selectively repressed some groups while leaving others relatively unmolested, or even rewarding still others, fragmented potential opposition, and made collective resistance more difficult to organise. Daily life continued because people adapted to constraints, found ways to pursue their interests within the limits imposed by autocratic rule, and accepted that open political opposition would bring consequences they were unwilling to face. The cultural and religious life of Akragas persisted not because Phalaris was enlightened, but because maintaining these traditions served his purposes of appearing legitimate, while the mechanisms of fear and violence ensured his actual control. Our knowledge of Phalaris comes entirely from ancient writers who lived long after his death, each using the Tyrant to serve their own literary, philosophical, or moral purposes. The earliest substantial reference appears in the poetry of Pindar, who wrote in the early 5th century BC, roughly a century after Phalaris' rule. Pindar was commissioned to write victory odes for successful athletes, including competitors from Akragas. In his first Pythian ode, celebrating a chariot victory by Hieron of Syracuse, Pindar contrasts Hieron's just rule with the evil reputation of Phalaris. He writes of the tyrant's harsh reputation that lives on in song, mentioning the bronze-walled chamber, and noting that Phalaris found no favour in the lyre's gentle music at symposia, where men gather to drink and converse. This reference established Phalaris in Greek literary tradition as the archetypal cruel tyrant, a cautionary example against which better rulers could be measured. Aristotle, writing in the 4th century BC, used Phalaris as a standard example in his philosophical and rhetorical works. In the Politics, Aristotle discusses different forms of government and the characteristics that distinguish legitimate rule from tyranny. Phalaris appears as an illustration of tyrannical excess, of rule that exists purely for the tyrant's benefit rather than for the common good. In the Rhetoric, Aristotle analyses how speakers use examples and historical references to persuade audiences. He notes that Phalaris serves effectively as an example of injustice because his reputation for cruelty was universally known to Greek audiences. Aristotle's use of Phalaris was analytical rather than narrative. He was less interested in telling the tyrant's story than in using him as a readily understood instance of a political and moral category. The most detailed ancient narrative comes from Diodorus Siculus, a Greek historian from Sicily, who wrote in the 1st century BC. His Bibliotheca Historica, a universal history attempting to chronicle events from mythological times through his own era, includes an extended account of Phalaris' rule. Diodorus describes the coup involving the temple construction, discusses the Brazen bull and Perilaus' fate, recounts various cruelties attributed to Phalaris, and narrates the tyrant's eventual overthrow and death. Diodorus presents this material within a clear moral framework. Phalaris represents the corruption of power, the human capacity for cruelty, and the inevitable divine justice that eventually punishes wrongdoers. For Diodorus, Phalaris' story demonstrated that tyranny ultimately fails, that excessive cruelty generates opposition that no amount of force can permanently suppress, and that the universe maintains moral order even when human institutions fail. Lucian of Samosata, writing in the 2nd century CE, took a different approach in his satirical dialogues. Lucian was a rhetorician and satirist who enjoyed playing with philosophical and moral conventions. In his dialogues titled Phalaris I and Phalaris II, he presents Phalaris defending himself against charges of cruelty. In these fictional speeches, Phalaris argues that his reputation has been exaggerated, that circumstances forced him to act harshly, that his rule brought benefits to Akragas despite necessary violence. Lucian's purpose was not historical accuracy, but rhetorical exercise and satire. By having Phalaris mount a defence, Lucian explored how even the most notorious villains might justify themselves, how rhetoric could be used to argue any position regardless of truth, and how audiences should critically examine persuasive speech rather than accepting arguments simply because they are cleverly presented. Polyenus, writing in the 2nd century CE, compiled the Stratagemata, a collection of military stratagems and tactical examples from Greek and foreign history. His brief mentions of Phalaris focus on tactical and military aspects of how the tyrant seized and maintained power. Polyenus describes the coup using temple construction as cover for assembling armed forces, presenting this as an example of strategic deception. His interest was practical rather than moral. How did Phalaris accomplish his objectives militarily? What tactics proved effective? What lessons might military commanders draw from his methods? This pragmatic treatment of Phalaris contrasts with the moral condemnation in other sources, showing how the same historical figure could be used for different purposes depending on the writer's goals. The epistles of Phalaris represent a fascinating case of ancient literary forgery. This collection of letters supposedly written by Phalaris to various correspondents circulated in the ancient world and was generally accepted as genuine until modern scholarship. The letters present Phalaris as a cultured, philosophically minded ruler who corresponded with intellectuals, offered moral advice, and reflected on governance. They portray a very different Phalaris from the cruel tyrant of other sources. Here he appears almost sympathetic, struggling with the burdens of power and trying to rule justly despite difficult circumstances. Modern scholars recognize these letters as forgeries, rhetorical exercises composed centuries after Phalaris' death. The letters became the subject of a famous 17th century controversy when the classical scholar Richard Bentley definitively proved they were not genuine. Bentley's analysis examined the letters' language, their references to historical events, and people whose chronology was wrong for Phalaris' time, and their literary style which did not match 6th century BC Greek. This controversy was significant in the history of classical scholarship because it demonstrated methods for distinguishing genuine ancient texts from later fabrications. Yet even as forgeries, the epistles reveal something important, that ancient writers found Phalaris interesting enough to imagine what he might have written, that there was an audience for alternative portrayals of the tyrant beyond simple moral condemnation. The letters suggest that Phalaris' story invited complex interpretation, that his character could be imagined in multiple ways depending on rhetorical and literary purposes. Each ancient writer who discussed Phalaris used him to illustrate broader points that mattered to their own times and audiences. Pindar used Phalaris to contrast bad and good leadership, to praise his patrons by showing they were nothing like the notorious tyrant. Aristotle used Phalaris as a philosophical category, an instance of unjust rule useful for teaching about political theory. Diodorus used Phalaris to demonstrate moral lessons about power, cruelty, and divine justice. Lucian used Phalaris to explore rhetoric and to satirize how persuasive speech could defend even indefensible positions. Polyenus used Phalaris as a tactical example divorced from moral judgment. The forgers of the epistles used Phalaris as a vehicle for rhetorical exercise, and possibly for exploring how tyrants might be more complex than simple moral categories allowed. This multiplicity of ancient portrayals means we cannot simply reconstruct what Phalaris was actually like from the sources. Each writer shaped his account according to literary conventions, philosophical purposes, moral frameworks, and audience expectations of their own very different historical moments. What we can say is that Phalaris became in ancient literature a symbol of tyrannical cruelty, of the corruption of power, of the consequences of unconstrained ambition. Whether the historical Phalaris fully matched this symbolic portrayal is impossible to determine with certainty, but the very persistence of his story across centuries of Greek and Roman literature testifies to its power as a cautionary tale about what happens when one man seizes absolute power and rules through fear. Phalaris' tyranny ended as many Greek tyrannies did, through conspiracy, violence, and the collapse of the fear that had sustained his rule. Ancient sources provide frustratingly limited detail about the specific circumstances of his overthrow, focusing more on his dramatic execution than on the mechanics of the coup that brought him down. What emerges from fragmentary accounts is a picture of accumulated resentment finally overwhelming the tyrant's security apparatus, though whether this happened through aristocratic conspiracy, popular uprising, or some combination remains unclear. Some ancient accounts suggest the conspiracy was led by aristocratic families who had survived Phalaris' initial purges and maintained their opposition throughout his rule. These families would have the strongest motivation to overthrow the tyrant, recovering lost political power, reclaiming confiscated property, avenging executed relatives. They also possessed the social networks and remaining resources to organise resistance despite surveillance and repression. Aristocratic conspirators could coordinate with exiled family members who maintained contacts outside Akragas, potentially securing promises of support from other Sicilian cities. One name that appears in some ancient sources is Telemachus, identified as a leader or significant figure in the revolt against Phalaris. Beyond his name, little information survives about Telemachus, whether he was an aristocrat from one of the old oligarchic families, a military commander who turned against the tyrant, or perhaps someone from a different social background who emerged as a leader during the uprising itself. The scarcity of detail about individuals involved in Phalaris' overthrow reflects the general pattern in ancient sources, which preserved the tyrant's name and story while leaving his opponents relatively anonymous. The actual events of the coup likely involved coordination between conspirators inside Akragas and possibly external support from other cities or from exiled Akragantines seeking return. Conspiracies needed to neutralise or bypass Phalaris' mercenary bodyguard, the primary military force protecting the tyrant. This might have been accomplished through bribing guards to defect or remain neutral, through surprising them during a moment of vulnerability, such as a religious festival when security was relaxed, or through assembling sufficient armed force among the conspirators themselves to overcome the guards in direct confrontation. The role of Phalaris' own military forces in his downfall raises important questions about tyrannical rule's ultimate fragility. Mercenaries were loyal as long as they were paid, and as long as the tyrant appeared likely to survive. But if a conspiracy seemed strong enough to succeed, mercenaries might calculate that switching sides, or simply standing aside, served their interests better than fighting for a doomed ruler. The guard's loyalty was transactional rather than ideological or personal, which made it reliable under normal circumstances, but potentially unstable if the tyrant's position appeared seriously threatened. Whether Phalaris attempted to flee when the conspiracy moved against him, or tried to fight to maintain power, depends on which ancient source one consults and how quickly events unfolded. If the coup happened rapidly, with conspirators seizing control of key locations and overwhelming the guards before Phalaris could respond effectively, he might have had little opportunity for organised resistance or escape. If the conspiracy developed more gradually, with parts of the city falling to rebels while the tyrant still controlled his immediate stronghold, Phalaris might have attempted to rally loyal forces or to escape to another city where he could seek refuge and plan a return. Ancient accounts agree that Phalaris was captured rather than killed immediately in fighting or successful in fleeing. This capture was essential to what followed, the decision to execute him in the Brazen Bull, turning his own instrument of torture against him. Whether Phalaris was betrayed by those close to him, perhaps by guards, or officials who concluded that handing him over to conspirators would save their own lives, or whether he was simply overwhelmed by superior force remains unclear. The psychology of such betrayals in collapsing tyrannies is complex. Those who had served the tyrant closely might face particular danger from victorious rebels unless they could demonstrate their rejection of the old regime through dramatic acts like delivering the tyrant himself to his enemies. How long Phalaris actually ruled presents a chronological puzzle that ancient sources do not resolve clearly. Different writers provide varying estimates. Some sources suggest approximately 16 years, which would place his rule from around 570 BC to roughly 554 BC. Other accounts extend his tyranny to 38 years, which would mean his rule lasted from approximately 570 BC until 532 BC. This wide variation reflects the absence of precise contemporary records and the difficulties ancient writers faced in establishing accurate chronologies for events centuries before their own time. Modern scholars attempting to establish more precise dating examine the limited archaeological evidence from Akragas, references in other sources that might provide chronological anchors, and the general historical context of Sicilian politics in the 6th century BC. Most scholarly estimates place Phalaris' rule closer to the shorter end of ancient accounts, perhaps 15 to 20 years rather than the longer estimates. This would still represent a substantial tyranny, long enough to leave deep marks on Akragas' political culture, and to create the accumulated resentment that eventually brought about his overthrow. The immediate aftermath of the coup saw violence directed against Phalaris' supporters and officials who had served his regime. Those most closely associated with the tyranny, administrators who had enforced his decrees, tax collectors who had extracted revenue, informants who had betrayed fellow citizens to the tyrant's security apparatus, faced retribution from the newly liberated population. Some were killed in the immediate chaos following Phalaris' capture. Others may have been tried and executed more formally, or forced into exile, or compelled to surrender property as compensation for their role in sustaining the tyranny. Exiled aristocratic families returned to Akragas, seeking to reclaim their confiscated estates and to restore their political positions. This restoration created its own complications and conflicts. Properties confiscated by Phalaris had often been redistributed to his supporters or sold to new owners who had purchased them in good faith. Determining which claims to honour, which current property holders to dispossess, and how to balance justice for victims of tyranny against stability for the post-tyrannical order would have generated significant political conflict. The establishment of a new government faced the question of what political system should replace the fallen tyranny. Would Akragas return to the oligarchic rule that had preceded Phalaris, with power concentrated again in aristocratic hands? Would the experience of tyranny lead to demands for broader political participation, perhaps moving toward more democratic forms of government? Would factional conflicts that tyranny had temporarily suppressed resurface immediately, leading to renewed instability? Ancient sources provide little detail about the political arrangements that followed Phalaris' death, suggesting either that Akragas returned relatively quickly to oligarchic rule, or that whatever government emerged was not distinctive enough to merit particular notice in later historical accounts. What ancient writers did focus on, what captured their imagination and shaped Phalaris' historical legacy, was not the mechanics of his overthrow or the details of post-tyrannical political reconstruction, but rather what happened to Phalaris himself once he was captured. The decision to place him inside the Brazen Bull and the poetic justice of the tyrant dying by the very instrument of torture he had commissioned. Once Phalaris was captured, the victorious citizens of Akragas faced the question of how to execute the fallen tyrant. They chose a method that ancient writers universally present as deliberate and symbolically perfect. Phalaris would die inside the Brazen Bull, experiencing the same fate he had inflicted on his own victims. This decision represented more than simple revenge. It embodied Greek concepts of appropriate justice, of cosmic balance restored, of the tyrant receiving punishment precisely calibrated to match his crimes. The instrument he had commissioned to make torture entertaining would now serve as the means of his own destruction. Ancient sources describing Phalaris's execution vary in their details, but agree on essential elements. The bronze bull still stood where Phalaris had kept it throughout his reign, a constant reminder of his power and cruelty. The population of Akragas gathered to witness what would happen. This public nature of the execution was crucial. The people who had lived under the tyrant's fear would see him reduced to helplessness, would witness justice enacted before their eyes, would experience collectively the restoration of order that his death represented. Some accounts suggest Phalaris was given opportunity to speak before being placed inside the bull. Whether he defended his actions, appealed for mercy, or remained silent varies across sources. Ancient writers often invented speeches for historical figures at crucial moments, creating words that fit their narrative purposes rather than reporting what was actually said. If Phalaris did speak, his words have not survived reliably. More likely, the sources that include final speeches are engaging in literary invention, giving the tyrant words that serve the writer's moral purposes rather than preserving historical fact. The question of whether Phalaris showed fear or defiance as he faced death similarly depends on which ancient account one reads. Some portrayals present him as terrified, reduced to begging for his life, losing all the authority and arrogance that had characterized his rule. This version satisfies audiences who want to see the tyrant completely humiliated, stripped not just of power, but of dignity. Other accounts present Phalaris facing death with a kind of grim acceptance or even defiance, maintaining composure in his final moments. This alternative portrayal might reflect Greek cultural values about facing death well, or it might serve to make the tyrant seem more formidable even in defeat, making his fall more dramatically significant. The actual process of execution followed the method Phalaris himself had established. The door of the bronze bull was opened. Phalaris was forced inside the hollow interior, where so many of his victims had died. The door was sealed behind him. Wood was placed beneath the bull. Fire was lit. As the flames grew and the bronze began to heat, those watching would have waited to hear what sounds emerged from the bull's mouth. Whether the acoustic system would transform Phalaris's screams, just as it had transformed the screams of those he had condemned. Ancient sources emphasize that Phalaris's execution was witnessed by the population of Akragas. This public spectacle served multiple functions. It provided concrete proof that the tyrant was truly dead, preventing later claims that he had escaped and might return. It allowed victims of his rule to witness his suffering, offering a kind of emotional closure or satisfaction. It demonstrated that justice had been restored, that the moral order violated by tyranny had been corrected. And it created a collective memory, a shared experience that would be transmitted through generations as the story of how Akragas had freed itself from tyranny. The symbolic significance of executing Phalaris in his own torture device cannot be overstated. This was poetic justice in its most literal form. The inventor of an instrument of torture had died by it first, and now the tyrant who had used that instrument to terrorise a city died by it as well. The reversal was complete. The power relationship that had defined Phalaris' rule, where he decided who lived and died while remaining untouchable himself, was inverted. He became subject to the same mechanism he had wielded against others. The bronze bull, which had symbolised tyrannical power and creative cruelty, became an instrument of justice and restoration of proper order. Greek thought emphasised the concept of nemesis, divine retribution that corrects imbalances in the cosmic moral order. Phalaris' death in the Brazen Bull represented nemesis enacted through human agency but reflecting divine justice. A man who had perverted civilization's achievements to create instruments of torture, who had ruled through fear and spectacular cruelty, who had violated the norms of proper governance, received punishment that precisely matched his transgressions. This symmetry satisfied deeply held Greek beliefs about how the universe maintained justice even when human institutions failed. Variations in ancient accounts of Phalaris' death range from relatively restrained descriptions to more graphic details. Some sources simply state that he was placed in the bull and executed, allowing readers to imagine the specifics. Others describe the sounds that emerged as the bull heated, the duration of his suffering, the crowd's reactions. These variations reflect both the different literary purposes of each writer and the passage of time between events and their recording. Writers centuries after Phalaris' death were constructing narratives based on earlier sources, oral traditions, and their own sense of what the story required, rather than reporting eyewitness accounts. What happened to Phalaris' body after death varies across sources. Some accounts suggest his body was removed from the bull and subjected to further indignities, perhaps thrown from the cliffs, perhaps denied proper burial as a final punishment. Denying burial was a serious matter in Greek culture, as proper funeral rites were necessary for the deceased spirit to find rest. Other sources do not specify the disposal of his body, leaving this detail to readers' imagination or considering it less important than the fact of his death. The fate of the bronze bull itself, after Phalaris' execution, offers several different versions. Some ancient sources claim the bull was dedicated to the gods, perhaps as a temple offering that transformed an instrument of torture into a sacred object acknowledging divine justice. This would ceremonially cleanse the bull of its profane associations, while preserving it as a memorial. Other accounts suggest the bull was destroyed, broken up, and perhaps melted down to eliminate a symbol of tyranny, and to ensure it could never be used again. A third possibility, mentioned in some sources, is that the bull was preserved as a memorial to tyranny's end, kept as a reminder of what Phalaris had done and how his rule had ended. The symbolic resonance of these different fates is significant. Dedicating the bull to the gods acknowledges divine involvement in justice. Destroying it eliminates physical traces of tyranny and prevents future misuse. Preserving it as memorial serves educational purposes, ensuring future generations remember both tyrannical cruelty and its eventual defeat. Which fate the bull actually met, if indeed it existed as more than legend, cannot be determined from surviving evidence. But the variety of versions reflects ancient writers grappling with what should happen to an object so intimately associated with both human cruelty and divine justice, with both tyrannical power and its ultimate overthrow. After Phalaris' death, Akragas faced the challenge of establishing a new political order that would prevent tyranny's return while managing competing claims to power and property. Ancient sources provide limited detail about the immediate post-tyrannical government, but the pattern that emerged was likely a return to oligarchic rule dominated by aristocratic families. These were the families who had led the conspiracy against Phalaris, who possessed the wealth and social networks to control the city, and who viewed themselves as the rightful holders of political power that tyranny had temporarily usurped. Democracy, in the sense of broad citizen participation in government, does not appear to have been established in Akragas at this time. The overthrow of tyranny meant restoration of aristocratic control rather than expansion of political rights to common citizens. The reversal of Phalaris' policies began immediately. Confiscated property needed to be addressed, though this created complex disputes. Aristocratic families demanded return of estates seized during Phalaris' rule, but those estates had often been redistributed to the tyrant supporters or sold to new owners who had acquired them legally under the tyrannical regime. Deciding which claims to honour required political negotiation and likely generated lasting resentment among those who lost property they had held for years. The new government probably prioritised restoring the most prominent aristocratic families while finding compromises for less powerful claimants. Exiled families returned to Akragas, bringing with them years of accumulated grievance and expectation of political reward for their opposition to the tyranny. These returnees reinforced the aristocratic character of the post-tyrannical government, while also potentially creating factional conflicts as different families competed for dominance in the new order. The transition from tyranny to oligarchy was not necessarily smooth or peaceful, even if it avoided the level of violence that had characterised Phalaris' rule. Phalaris' mercenary forces presented a practical problem. These professional soldiers had no natural place in post-tyrannical Akragas. They could not simply be released into the population where they might cause trouble or form the core of another would-be tyrant's following. The new government likely disbanded the mercenary units, either paying them to leave Akragas entirely or integrating select individuals into the city's regular military structure, while ensuring they no longer formed a cohesive force loyal to any single leader. The elimination of this permanent armed body, separate from the citizen militia, was essential to preventing future tyrannical coups. Economically, Akragas not only recovered from Phalaris' rule, but entered a period of remarkable prosperity in the decades following his death. The city's agricultural base remained strong. The fertile land that had attracted Greek colonists initially continued producing abundant grain and supporting successful horse breeding. Trade through Akragas' harbour flourished as political stability returned, and as the city's reputation for wealth attracted merchants. By the early 5th century BC, Akragas had become one of the wealthiest Greek cities in Sicily, rivaling even Syracuse in prosperity and cultural achievement. This economic success enabled dramatic cultural and architectural development. The experience of Phalaris' rule may have shaped Akragas' political culture by creating wariness of concentrated power and appreciation for civic institutions that checked individual ambition. The city's prosperity was channeled into public works and religious monuments that demonstrated civic identity and collective achievement, rather than any individual's dominance. This stood in deliberate contrast to Phalaris, whose rule had been about personal power rather than civic glory. The most visible legacy of post-tyrannical Akragas is the Valley of the Temples, one of the most impressive concentrations of Greek temple architecture anywhere in the ancient world. These massive Doric temples were constructed primarily in the 5th century BC, decades after Phalaris' death. The Temple of Concordia, remarkably well preserved into modern times, the Temple of Hera Lacinia, the Temple of Heracles, the enormous Temple of Olympian Zeus, which was never completed. These structures demonstrated Akragas' wealth and civic ambition. Each temple required enormous resources, skilled labour, and years of construction. Collectively, they transformed Akragas into one of the most architecturally impressive Greek cities anywhere. The construction of these temples served multiple purposes beyond religious devotion. They provided employment for citizens and attracted skilled craftsmen from across the Greek world. They demonstrated Akragas' prosperity and power to other cities. They created lasting monuments to civic achievement that would outlast any individual ruler's life. And they may have represented a conscious rejection of Phalaris' legacy, where the tyrant had used bronze working to create instruments of torture. Post-tyrannical Akragas used its resources to honour the gods and beautify the city for all citizens. Ancient writers celebrated Akragas' prosperity and culture in the decades after Phalaris. The philosopher Empedocles, born in Akragas around 490 BC, became one of the most important pre-Socratic thinkers. The city's horses continued winning victories at Panhellenic Games. Wealthy Akragantines commissioned victory odes from poets including Pindar, who praised the city's achievements while remembering Phalaris as a cautionary contrast. Akragas had transformed its identity from a city known for tyranny to a city celebrated for wealth, culture, and magnificent architecture. Yet prosperity could not insulate Akragas from the larger conflicts that shaped Sicilian history. The Carthaginians, who controlled western Sicily, represented a constant external threat to Greek cities on the island. In 406 BC, Carthaginian forces under Hannibal Margo besieged and captured Akragas. The city was sacked, much of its population was killed or enslaved, and many of its magnificent temples were damaged or destroyed. This catastrophe ended Akragas' golden age and demonstrated that even the wealthiest and most beautiful cities remained vulnerable to military power. Akragas was eventually rebuilt and continued as a significant Sicilian city through the classical period and beyond. It fell under Syracuse's control at times, regained independence at others, and eventually came under Roman rule as the Romans conquered Sicily in the 3rd century BC. Under Roman administration, the city, renamed Agrigentum, continued as a regional centre, though it never recovered the extraordinary prosperity and cultural significance it had achieved in the 5th century BC. The subsequent history of Akragas, from its golden age through Carthaginian destruction to eventual Roman incorporation, shows that Phalaris' tyranny was only one chapter in a much longer story. Yet Phalaris remained the episode for which the city was most remembered in ancient literature and historical consciousness. The temples eventually fell into ruin. The economic prosperity faded. The horses that once won Olympic victories were forgotten, but the story of the tyrant and his bronze bull endured across centuries, preserved in literature and historical memory as a cautionary tale about power, cruelty, and the justice that eventually corrects tyrannical excess. Akragas built magnificent temples and achieved great wealth, but it was Phalaris and his instrument of torture that ancient writers found most compelling, most worthy of preservation in the collective memory of Greek civilization. The story of Phalaris began its journey from historical event to enduring legend through oral tradition in Sicily and the wider Greek world. In the generations immediately following his death, the tale would have been transmitted through the memories of those who had lived under his rule, through the accounts of exiled families who had opposed him, and through the collective memory of Akragas itself. These oral accounts shaped how later writers understood Phalaris when they began recording his story in written form. Pindar's reference to Phalaris in the early 5th century BC, roughly a century after the Tyrant's death, represents the earliest surviving written mention. This established Phalaris in Greek literary tradition as a standard example of tyrannical cruelty against which better rulers could be measured. Subsequent Greek writers incorporated Phalaris into historical narratives, philosophical discussions, and rhetorical exercises. Each retelling reinforced his symbolic significance, while potentially adding new details or interpretations. By the classical period of Greek literature in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, Phalaris had become what scholars call a moral exemplum, a historical figure whose story served to illustrate ethical and political lessons. Writers could invoke his name, confident that audiences would immediately understand the reference. Aristotle used Phalaris this way in his philosophical works, not needing to explain who Phalaris was, because educated Greeks already knew. This kind of cultural shorthand indicates how thoroughly Phalaris' story had been integrated into Greek moral and political discourse. Greek and Roman moralists found Phalaris particularly useful for teaching about tyranny and justice. Unlike mythological villains, whose stories involved gods and supernatural elements, Phalaris was historical, a real person who had seized real power and committed real cruelties. This made him more immediately applicable to discussions of actual political situations. Writers could point to Phalaris when warning about the dangers of concentrated power, when arguing for constitutional restraints on rulers, or when illustrating how tyranny inevitably generates opposition that leads to the tyrant's downfall. The incorporation of the Phalaris story into philosophical and rhetorical education meant that generations of students across the Greek and later the Roman world learned about the tyrant and his bronze bull. Rhetoric teachers used Phalaris as a subject for practice speeches. Students might be assigned to defend or prosecute Phalaris, to imagine speeches he might have given, or to argue about whether his punishment fit his crimes. These educational exercises kept the story alive, while also allowing each generation to reinterpret it according to their own concerns and values. As Rome conquered the Greek world and absorbed Greek culture, Roman writers inherited the Phalaris tradition. Latin authors, including Cicero, referenced Phalaris when discussing tyranny and justice. The story fitted Roman moral frameworks about the corruption of power and the importance of law and republican institutions. Through Roman literature, Phalaris' story was preserved and transmitted to medieval Europe when classical learning was maintained primarily through Latin texts. Medieval European knowledge of Phalaris came primarily through Latin sources rather than direct access to Greek originals. Medieval writers on political theory and moral philosophy included Phalaris in their catalogues of tyrants and examples of unjust rule. The brazen bull appeared in medieval texts as a symbol of torture and cruelty, sometimes illustrated in manuscripts depicting instruments of punishment. Medieval moral literature used Phalaris to teach lessons about divine justice and the inevitable punishment of wickedness, fitting his story into Christian frameworks about sin and retribution. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical antiquity, and with it fresh attention to Greek history and literature. Humanist scholars sought out Greek texts, translated them into Latin and vernacular languages, and incorporated classical examples into their own writings. Phalaris reappeared in Renaissance political philosophy as writers like Machiavelli discussed tyranny and the exercise of power. The brazen bull became a subject for artistic depiction, appearing in paintings and engravings that illustrated classical history and mythology. These visual representations helped transmit the story to audiences beyond those who read Latin or Greek. The 17th century brought a fascinating scholarly controversy that revealed important information about how ancient texts were transmitted and authenticated. The epistles of Phalaris, supposedly letters written by the tyrant himself, had circulated since ancient times. Most scholars accepted them as genuine until 1699, when Richard Bentley, an English classical scholar, published a devastating analysis proving the letters were forgeries composed centuries after Phalaris' death. Bentley's argument examined the letters' language, identifying vocabulary and grammatical constructions that did not exist in the 6th century BC. He analysed historical references in the letters, showing they mentioned people and events from periods long after Phalaris' time. He demonstrated that the letters' literary style did not match what we know about archaic Greek prose. This controversy became famous in the history of classical scholarship because Bentley's methods established principles for authenticating ancient texts that scholars still use today. The controversy over the epistles also revealed something important about cultural attitudes toward Phalaris. That someone in antiquity had composed fake letters from the tyrant suggested ongoing fascination with his character. That these letters presented Phalaris more sympathetically than other sources indicated desire to explore alternative interpretations of his story. And that 17th century scholars debated the letters' authenticity with such intensity showed that Phalaris remained culturally significant more than 2,000 years after his death. References to Phalaris and the Brazen Bull continued through the 18th and 19th centuries in literature, political philosophy, and popular culture. Enlightenment thinkers discussing political liberty and the dangers of absolute power invoked Phalaris as a historical example. Romantic-era writers interested in dramatic historical subjects sometimes incorporated Phalaris into poems or plays. The Brazen Bull became a standard reference in discussions of torture and cruel punishment. In modern times, Phalaris appears primarily in historical works, in classical studies, and in cultural references that draw on knowledge of ancient history. The Brazen Bull has become a symbol in discussions about torture, about the perversion of technological skill to cruel purposes, and about poetic justice. Modern historians debate whether Phalaris and the Brazen Bull were real or legendary, examining the evidence and the gaps in our knowledge. Modern writers and artists continue to find the story compelling, using it to explore themes of power, cruelty, justice, and revenge. The transmission of Phalaris' story across more than 2.5 millennia demonstrates something important about how historical memory works. Details changed as the story passed through different cultures and time periods. Writers adapted the tale to serve their own purposes: moral instruction, political argument, rhetorical exercise, or entertainment. Yet the core narrative remained remarkably stable. A tyrant commissioned an instrument of torture, used it against his enemies, and eventually died by that same instrument. This stability suggests the story touched something fundamental in human concerns about power, about justice, and about the eventual correction of tyrannical excess. Phalaris may have been forgotten if he had been merely another brutal tyrant. But the Bronze Bull, with its perverse ingenuity and its ultimate reversal against its creator, made his story memorable enough to survive the collapse of civilizations, the loss of countless texts, and the passage of more than 25 centuries. Modern historians face a fundamental challenge when studying Phalaris. All surviving sources were written centuries after his death. Pindar, the earliest writer to mention Phalaris, lived roughly a century after the tyrant's rule ended. Diodorus Siculus, who provides the most detailed narrative, wrote approximately 500 years later, Lucian composed his dialogues featuring Phalaris more than 700 years after the events. This enormous temporal gap means we cannot access contemporary accounts written by people who witnessed Phalaris' tyranny firsthand. Everything we know has been filtered through generations of transmission, reinterpretation, and literary adaptation. This gap creates space for skepticism about whether specific details in the Phalaris story represent historical facts or later embellishment. The Brazen Bull particularly invites doubt because it seems almost too perfect narratively. The inventor becoming the first victim, the tyrant eventually dying in his own torture device, the poetic justice so complete that it reads like myth rather than history. Some scholars argue the bull was invented by later writers as a symbol of tyrannical cruelty, a vivid image that captured everything evil about Phalaris' rule in a single memorable object. The story's literary qualities, its dramatic irony, its moral symmetry, its spectacular nature might indicate fiction rather than historical record. Arguments for the bull being literary invention emphasize that no contemporary source mentions it. If such a remarkable device had existed, surely writers closer to Phalaris' time would have described it. The silence of earlier sources suggests later invention. Additionally, the bull serves such obvious symbolic purposes in teaching about tyranny and justice that it seems almost designed for moral instruction rather than emerging from messy, historical reality. Skeptics also note that torture devices attributed to various historical periods often turn out to be later inventions, myths about the past rather than accurate historical accounts. Counter-arguments defending the bull's historical existence point to the consistency of ancient descriptions across multiple independent sources. Writers from different time periods and regions agree on essential details: the hollow bronze sculpture, the acoustic system transforming screams, Perilaus as creator and first victim, Phalaris eventually dying in the bull. This consistency suggests a common tradition, preserving real historical memory rather than independent invention of similar fictions. Additionally, nothing about the bull's construction was technologically impossible for 6th century BC craftsmen. Bronze working techniques and acoustic understanding required to create such a device existed in the archaic Greek world. Scholars also question what motivation later writers would have for inventing such a specific instrument. If the goal was simply to portray Phalaris as cruel, simpler methods would suffice, describing mass executions, torture, or arbitrary violence without the elaborate detail of the bronze bull. The specificity of the bull's design, including technical details about its acoustic system and construction, seems more like historical preservation than creative invention. Why invent such precise details if the goal was merely symbolic representation of tyranny? Chronological debates complicate efforts to establish basic facts about Phalaris' rule. Ancient sources provide varying estimates for how long he governed Akragas, ranging from 16 to 38 years. These incompatible timelines make it difficult to date specific events or to correlate Phalaris' rule with other datable occurrences in Sicilian or wider Greek history. Modern scholars attempting to establish more precise chronology examine archaeological evidence from Akragas, references in other sources that might provide anchors, and the general historical context. Most scholarly estimates favour shorter rather than longer rule durations, but significant uncertainty remains. Questions about the extent of Phalaris' actual cruelty versus propagandistic exaggeration reflect broader challenges in studying ancient tyrants. Accounts of tyrants were typically written by their opponents, or by later writers operating within literary traditions that portrayed tyranny negatively. Exaggeration served political purposes. Blackening a tyrant's reputation justified the coup that overthrew him and warned against future would-be tyrants. Ancient writers also had literary reasons to emphasize cruelty, as dramatic stories of excess were more memorable and more useful for moral instruction than nuanced portrayals of moderately repressive rule. Comparative studies examining Phalaris, alongside other archaic Greek tyrants, help assess what aspects of his rule were typical versus exceptional. Tyrannical seizure of power through exploiting class conflict, use of mercenary bodyguards, elimination of aristocratic opponents through execution or exile, confiscation of property, and rule without constitutional restraint were all standard features of Greek tyranny. In these respects, Phalaris followed established patterns. What made him distinctive, what ensured his story endured while other tyrants were forgotten, was specifically the Brazen Bull, either a real instrument that exemplified creative cruelty or a symbolic invention that captured tyrannical excess so memorably that it shaped all subsequent retellings. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence from Akragas provides disappointingly little direct information about Phalaris' reign. Extensive excavations at the site of ancient Akragas have uncovered temples, fortifications, residential areas, and burial sites, but no physical traces of a brazen bull have been discovered. No inscriptions from the 6th century BC mentioning Phalaris have been found. No contemporary artistic depictions showing the bull or referencing his rule have survived. This absence of physical evidence does not prove Phalaris or the bull never existed. Bronze was valuable and would likely have been melted down and reused after his fall. Inscriptions from this period are rare generally, and many artifacts from ancient Akragas have been lost. But neither does archaeology provide support for the ancient literary accounts. The challenge modern historians face is operating with incomplete evidence, while avoiding both excessive skepticism that dismisses ancient sources simply because they are ancient, and excessive credulity that accepts literary accounts as straightforward historical fact. Phalaris almost certainly existed as a historical figure. His appearance in multiple independent sources and the specific details about Akragas in the 6th century BC suggest real historical memory rather than complete invention. Whether the brazen bull existed as a physical device or as a powerful literary symbol remains genuinely uncertain. What we can say with confidence is that Phalaris' story, whether historically accurate in every detail or shaped by generations of retelling, captured something fundamental about Greek concerns with power, justice, and the limits of civilized behaviour that ensured its preservation across more than 2 millennia. Phalaris remains hated across more than 2 millennia, not primarily because of the number of people he killed, but because of how he killed them and what that method represented. The brazen bull embodied a particular kind of evil that resonates across cultures and time periods. The deliberate application of human ingenuity and technical skill to maximize suffering while transforming it into entertainment. This was not killing from necessity, from military strategy, or even from rage. This was killing as performance art, torture designed to please aesthetically while destroying the victim. That combination of sadistic creativity and technological sophistication touches something deeply disturbing about human capacity for cruelty. The psychological impact of the brazen bull as a symbol operates on multiple levels. First, it represents the perversion of civilization's achievements. Bronzeworking was among the ancient world's most advanced technologies, requiring specialized knowledge, expensive materials, and sophisticated techniques. Using this technology to create instruments of torture symbolise the corruption of progress itself, the turning of human advancement toward evil purposes. Second, the acoustic system that transformed screams into musical sounds embodied a particularly disturbing form of dehumanization, reducing the victim's suffering to entertainment, stripping away the humanity of their agony by converting it into sounds resembling an animal. The execution of Perilaus, the bull's creator, added another layer to Phalaris' enduring infamy. This demonstrated that even those who served the tyrant, who provided him with tools for his cruelty, were not safe from that cruelty themselves. It showed Phalaris as willing to betray anyone, as operating without loyalty or gratitude, as dangerous not just to enemies, but to everyone in his orbit. This breach of the reciprocal obligations that governed patron-client relationships in the ancient world marked Phalaris as violating fundamental social norms even beyond his tyrannical seizure of power. Yet what truly ensures Phalaris' story endures is not just the horror of what he did, but the satisfaction of how he ended. His death in the Brazen Bull creates a narrative of perfect poetic justice that appeals to deep human desires for moral order and appropriate punishment. The concept that wrongdoers should suffer fates matching their crimes, that cosmic justice eventually corrects human evil, that tyranny contains the seeds of its own destruction. These ideas find perfect illustration in Phalaris' story. The narrative satisfaction of this ending makes the story memorable and ensures its cultural transmission across generations. Stories that embody poetic justice have psychological power that extends beyond historical accuracy or literary quality. Research in moral psychology suggests humans have strong intuitions about proportional punishment and appropriate consequences. We find narratives satisfying when punishment fits crime, when those who inflict suffering eventually experience equivalent suffering themselves, when power relationships reverse and the mighty fall while the oppressed rise. Phalaris' story delivers this satisfaction completely. The tyrant dies by his own torture device, experiencing what he inflicted on others, reduced to the helplessness his victims felt. This moral satisfaction explains why Phalaris has been used across centuries as a cautionary tale in education. Teachers of ethics, politics and philosophy could point to Phalaris when instructing students about the corruption of absolute power. The story illustrated abstract concepts through vivid narrative, the danger of unconstrained authority, the inevitable generation of opposition that tyranny produces, the cosmic justice that corrects human evil. Children learning moral lessons and adults studying political philosophy encountered Phalaris as a figure whose fate demonstrated universal truths about power and justice. The question of why Phalaris remains more universally reviled than tyrants who killed far more people reveals something important about human moral judgment. Scale matters less than manner when assessing cruelty. A tyrant who kills thousands in warfare pursuing strategic objectives, or even a dictator who executes large numbers of political opponents, commits terrible acts but does not necessarily inspire the particular horror that Phalaris does. The Brazen Bull represents cruelty for its own sake, suffering designed and engineered rather than simply inflicted, torture made into spectacle. This creativity in cruelty, this perverse application of skill and thought to maximizing pain, violates intuitions about proper human behaviour in ways that even larger-scale violence might not. The Phalaris narrative has shaped Western concepts of tyranny, justice, and appropriate punishment in lasting ways. When political philosophers discuss the dangers of autocratic rule, when legal theorists debate proportional punishment, when ethicists examine the limits of state power, Phalaris appears as a reference point. The Brazen Bull has become shorthand for torture and cruel punishment in discussions spanning from ancient rhetoric to modern human rights advocacy. The image of the bronze bull appears in modern discussions about torture's immorality, about whether any circumstances justify inflicting extreme suffering, about the human capacity for sadistic innovation. Modern references to Phalaris and the Brazen Bull appear in diverse contexts. Human rights organisations discussing torture methods reference the Brazen Bull as a historical example of systematic cruelty. Popular culture incorporates the bull in films, television, and literature dealing with historical horror or with themes of justice and revenge. Academic discussions of ancient history, of tyranny, of punishment theory invoke Phalaris regularly. The story maintains relevance because it speaks to permanent features of human experience: the existence of power, the potential for its abuse, the hope for justice, and the satisfaction when that justice arrives. Psychological research on narrative preferences helps explain the Brazen Bull story's endurance. Studies show that people across cultures prefer stories where moral violations receive appropriate punishment, where narrative arcs resolve toward justice rather than leaving evil unpunished. Stories of karmic reversal, where those who inflict harm eventually suffer equivalent harm themselves, activate reward centers in the brain associated with satisfaction and completion. The Phalaris narrative delivers this satisfaction perfectly through the mechanism of the bronze bull itself. The instrument becomes both crime and punishment, symbol and enactor of justice. Phalaris remains hated not because ancient sources told us to hate him, but because his story encapsulates fears and hopes that transcend any particular historical period. The fear that human ingenuity will be perverted to cruel purposes, that power will corrupt absolutely, that sadistic creativity exists in human nature, the hope that justice will eventually prevail, that tyrants will fall, that cosmic order will reassert itself against human evil. The Brazen Bull, whether it existed as historical fact or symbolic legend, captures these universal themes in bronze, permanent, memorable, and ultimately transforming the tyrant's instrument of torture into a monument to the justice that ended his reign. The Brazen Bull has entered modern popular culture as a recognisable symbol of historical cruelty and poetic justice. Films depicting ancient history or exploring themes of torture and revenge sometimes reference or recreate the Brazen Bull. Video games set in ancient periods or dealing with historical horrors have incorporated the bull as an element of world building or as a memorable set piece. Literature, spanning historical fiction to fantasy, has borrowed the image of the bronze bull, using it to evoke tyranny and the eventual fate of tyrants. Television programs about ancient history, about torture methods through the ages, or about concepts of justice regularly feature the Phalaris story as a compelling example. Political rhetoric continues to invoke Phalaris when characterizing modern dictators or cruel leaders. Comparing a contemporary ruler to Phalaris carries immediate connotations. Not just that the leader is authoritarian or violent, but that they exhibit creative sadism, that they pervert technological advancement for cruel purposes, that they will eventually face justice comparable to their crimes. The Brazen Bull functions in political discourse as shorthand for a particular kind of evil leadership, one that goes beyond necessary violence or strategic cruelty into territory of inflicting suffering for its own sake. Discussions of torture, capital punishment, and proportionate justice frequently reference the Brazen Bull as a metaphor and historical example. Human rights advocates arguing against torture point to the Brazen Bull as representing what happens when states or individuals claim authority to inflict extreme suffering. Legal theorists debating capital punishment use Phalaris' story to explore questions about whether execution methods matter ethically or whether death itself is the only morally relevant factor. Philosophers examining proportionate justice, whether punishment should match crime in kind or merely in severity, find in the Brazen Bull a vivid illustration of these abstract concepts made concrete. Scholarly interest in Phalaris persists within classical studies, ancient history, and political philosophy. Classicists examine the ancient sources critically, attempting to distinguish historical fact from literary embellishment. Historians of ancient Sicily study Phalaris within the broader context of Greek colonization, tyranny in the Archaic period, and the development of Sicilian city-states. Political philosophers use Phalaris as a case study in tyrannical rule, analysing what his story reveals about power, legitimacy, and resistance to autocracy. Academic conferences on ancient history regularly feature papers examining aspects of Phalaris' rule, or the transmission of his story through ancient literature. Modern Agrigento, built on and around the site of ancient Akragas, attracts tourists primarily to see the Valley of the Temples, the remarkable concentration of Greek temple ruins that represents the city's golden age after Phalaris. The temples themselves, particularly the well-preserved Temple of Concordia, demonstrate the prosperity and cultural achievement that post-tyrannical Akragas reached. The Archaeological Museum in Agrigento houses artifacts from ancient Akragas spanning various periods of the city's history. While Phalaris represents only one chapter in Akragas' long history, tourist information and museum displays typically mention the Tyrant as part of the city's narrative, acknowledging that many visitors arrive with some knowledge of his story. The story of Phalaris contributes to broader understanding of human capacity for both innovation and atrocity. The Brazen Bull represents the dark side of technological progress, the recognition that the same ingenuity that builds civilizations can be turned toward destruction and suffering. This theme remains relevant in any era where technological advancement raises ethical questions about how new capabilities will be used. Phalaris' story reminds us that cruelty can be creative, that inflicting suffering can become an art form for those without moral constraints, and that power without accountability enables the worst human impulses. Yet the story also affirms the human capacity for justice and resistance. Phalaris did not rule forever. His tyranny generated opposition that eventually overthrew him. The very instrument he used to terrorise his subjects became the means of his own execution, demonstrating a kind of cosmic justice that satisfies deep moral intuitions. This aspect of the story explains why it has endured, not just as a tale of horror, but as a narrative of hope that evil regimes eventually fall, and that tyrants face consequences for their actions. The enduring fascination with Phalaris, evidenced by continued academic publications, popular histories, and cultural references 2,500 years after his death, reflects the story's ability to speak to permanent aspects of human experience. Every generation faces questions about power and its limits, about the proper response to tyranny, about whether justice will prevail. Every society must grapple with how to prevent the abuse of authority and what to do when prevention fails. Phalaris' story offers no simple answers to these questions, but it provides a memorable framework for thinking about them, a narrative that has proven sufficiently powerful to survive the collapse of empires, the transformation of cultures, and the passage of millennia. The Bronze Bull whether it existed as historical artifact or literary symbol, has achieved a kind of immortality that Phalaris himself never sought. He wanted power, security, the ability to eliminate threats and inspire fear. What he received was infamy, a name that became synonymous with tyrannical cruelty, a story that would be told and retold across centuries as a warning about absolute power and its consequences. The tyrant who commissioned an instrument to make music from suffering became himself a cautionary note in the long human song about justice, revenge, and the eventual correction of evil. His legend persists not because we admire him, but because his fall satisfies something fundamental in human moral imagination. The belief that tyrants will eventually face justice, that cruelty contains the seeds of its own destruction, and that even the most terrible instruments of oppression can be turned against those who wielded them